Jack.
Levi.
The Book Club from Hell.
Hello everyone, this is Jack with the Book Club from Hell, two sentient Komatsu wheel loaders who have learned to skillfully imitate human speech. This week's episode is on The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon, published in 1961. Fanon, born in Martinique, was a psychiatrist, philosopher and influential anti-colonial thinker who fought in the Second World War and, while practicing psychiatry in Algeria in the 1950s, joined the anti-colonial FLN party, assisting the organisation in the Algerian War of Independence against France. The Wretched of the Earth was Fanon's final work, dictated while he was suffering from leukemia, and is an enduringly influential piece of anti-colonial literature. If you like what we're doing with this podcast and want to support us, we have a Patreon account, the link to which is in the show notes. We release bonus episodes on Patreon, as well as releasing notes for episodes. I've also published a novel called Tower, a surreal, absurd journey involving the medical treatment of souls, a tower who remakes the world in its image, amphetamines, and the resacralization of everything. You can find Tower on Amazon or on Apple Books, the links to which are in the show notes. So, if you're ready to obey the people's will, then listen on. Enjoy.
What are we talking about today, Jack?
We're talking about colonialism. We're talking about The Wretched of the Earth by Frantz Fanon.
This is a long time coming, this one. We're going to decolonize this motherfucking podcast. We're kicking Jack off. We're kicking Ed off. It's just going to be the Levi show from now on. It's just going to be me talking to myself.
But you're not allowed to do it in English.
Yeah, I'm not allowed to do it in English, and I can only do it to half of my genome. I'm going to decolonize myself. I'm going to extract all of the European DNA out of myself.
Yeah, we thought the listener base for this podcast was too big, so it's now going to be a non-English language podcast.
Yeah, I think Latin America is really like the next big thing, hey? You know, some of the biggest genres on Spotify are like these Latin American genres. They're huge. Yeah. So maybe we need to learn Spanish and start doing...
Are you saying that instead of covering
Spanish
weird books, we should just be releasing reggaeton albums?
Reggaeton with lyrics
Reggaeton, is
about
that how it's
decolonization. Yeah, reggaeton.
Okay, so we're just going to need to do reggaeton.
Well, that's
from
how I
now
say
on.
it. Reggaeton. I suppose it's like reggae. But yeah, it sounds like reggaeton to me.
I don't know. I mean, I just don't listen to that. I don't think I've ever even said it out loud.
Yeah. Yeah. That's fair enough. It was built, that sort of music is made for people who can like move their hips in more than one axis, Jack. Anyways.
Yeah.
Just up and down. They like to gyrate and stuff as well.
My idea of dancing is going to a hardcore show and hitting someone in the face or getting hit in the face.
Like, dancing is actually just violence.
It actually is just violence. Like, you can have death metal violence, which is mostly shoving each other, or you can have hardcore violence where people are actually just trying to hit you.
Yeah. Yeah, it looks scary.
Yeah, I'm always pretty nervous before a hardcore show. Some of them, there's quite a real possibility of getting properly injured. Eating someone's backswing.
Have you ever gotten into the mix?
Yeah.
Properly?
That's why you go.
That's a whole different side of you I've never seen, Jack.
Yeah, well, you just go and let it all out in a nice controlled environment. Physical violence is not only condoned but encouraged.
Jack's seething anger boils up and is released at the Fight Club, where they listen to some obscure European hardcore music or whatever. Jack just goes nuts.
Yeah, so what are we talking about? Oh yeah, Frantz Fanon is what we were talking about.
Yeah, the topic of today. He's written a book, The Wretched of the Earth. He wrote another really interesting sounding book as well. It was called like Black Faces, White Skin or something like that. Which also sounded interesting, which I might read on my own at some point in the future. Really interesting thinker. Why did you pick this book, Jack,
Been requested by a few people, and while weird right-wing stuff consistently does the best in terms of listens and views for this podcast, I don't want this to turn into us doing esoteric or populist right-wing stuff. So there was that. It means it means that when it comes to recommendations, I'm often more amenable to to left-wing things. But also this book just got requested quite a number of times, and I was aware of it anyway and did want to read it anyway because it's very, very influential in anti-colonial literature. And I just hadn't read it. So every now and then the stars align and there is something for the podcast that comes up that I would want to read anyway.
Yep.
So I did took that opportunity.
And it'll actually be a novel concept for the show.
Yeah, I don't think we've...
No, we haven't.
No, we haven't done any anti-colonial
stuff. Yeah.
Like, I guess that there are some... There's, anti-colonialism in the negative. Like, I'm sure Evola wants Hyperboreans to leave the Lemurian lands because that's not their place, but this is positive anti-colonialism.
Also, I apologize to anybody if my mic just changed a heap. I'm trying not to knock the fucking mic so much.
Oh, that's...
So I'm adjusting it a little bit. Like, hopefully it's not too... My girlfriend keeps on complaining how much I knock the mic, so I'm trying to get better. Sorry, guys. Yeah, so... yeah, I think it's great. It's a good topic to get into. Jack suggested another book. What was it? Is that You Gentiles?
You Gentiles, yeah. And
which is
Levi
about,
asked if we could not do it.
I was like, can we, whilst there's this massive war going on and there's all this like anti-Semitism popping off and stuff, can we maybe just like leave that a few months and come back to
yeah, that was an alarmingly sensible thing to
say. Like,
don't worry, J-Man. You Gentiles is coming. It'll happen eventually. We'll just wait for things to cool off a little bit.
We have like, yeah, the request from like secular Jewish person asking us to cover this, like
repeatedly asked us to do You Gentiles.
to do You Gentiles. And yeah, so we will at some point, just not right now. Yeah.
Yeah. So instead, you're getting The Wretched of the Earth. In terms of expectations going into this book, were you aware of this book? Did you have any sort of preconceived notions of it?
I'd never heard of Frantz Fanon, and my exposure to anti-colonial thinking is through an Australian Indigenous context. I think Fanon's been influential across the world, but it's pretty different as well to like the stuff that I've been exposed to. So my expectations going in were not huge. I didn't really know what to expect. The idea of violence, I suppose, I was a little bit interested in because I know that is always a sort of thing when you're talking about decolonization. Do you mean decolonization as in like some of the stuff that happened in Africa, which now that we've seen it pan out, hasn't really worked out so well for anybody, versus like decolonization like in India with Indian independence, which is very different. So I was open to just like seeing what, and it's also African/Caribbean, so that's also just very different, different like perspective on what. I don't know if like African people consider themselves indigenous, you know, like certainly some African people, I see them using that word, but there's like, I don't know, like Africa is such like an ethnically diverse place. And they also have like these, like, for example, like Ethiopia and stuff, they have like extremely large, sophisticated like social institutions and stuff before colonization. Whereas I often see like indigenous ideas and First Nation stuff spoken about in places like Australia differently, I guess. There's like a different sense in the Kansas countries, I guess, of what it means. Not really sure. Maybe this episode will be a good chance for me to articulate. I guess we'll see. What was your expectation going in?
I'd heard a bit about Fanon, and it was pretty polarized. The opinions I'd heard of him, I'd either heard he's brilliant. He almost single-handedly founded the anti-colonialist school of thought, which I thought was probably hyperbolic, and it is. Or I'd heard that he was vicious, absolutely loathed white people, and celebrated physical violence, which, having read the book, I think the people who say that just haven't read anything by Fanon. That's also hyperbolic. So I expected it to be really, really extreme because I've heard such polarized views on it. It was less extreme than I anticipated. A lot more Marxist than I anticipated. We can talk about the way in which, or at least I felt, it had a Marxist sense to it. I guess that we can do that when we come across how the book is written. So I was interested in it, mostly to see which group of people talking about it were closest to the truth. And as usual, the actual book, which has so much discussion surrounding it, lies somewhere in the middle of what people say. I don't think Fanon hated white people. I don't think he was advocating for just mindless violence all the time. I think he was much more reasonable than that.
Yeah, who would have thunk it?
Yeah, who'd have thought? So, do you want to talk about his biography? Because Fanon,
really interesting person.
Yeah, Fanon's life informed a lot of his thought about colonialism, and he had a really interesting life. So, he was born in 1925 in Martinique in the French West Indies, or the then French West Indies. And I knew so little about Martinique. So it's an island in the eastern Caribbean Sea. Was part of the French West Indies, but these were disestablished in 1946. But it's still an overseas department and region of the French Republic. It's part of the EU. They use the euro, although it's not part of the Schengen area, so they don't get free movement.
Kind of makes sense. That's not a part of the Schengen area. It's like a thing that's on the other side of the planet. Yeah. But at least kind of economically, they're a part of the EU, which I suppose maybe they like that. I suppose it maybe opens up Europe a lot more for them economically.
Yeah,
but I'm not sure if they're part of
the customs union. I don't think it's part of the customs union, but it's legally part of France.
I wonder what the deal with that is. Because if you look at the ethnic composition, it's like mostly Creole African. So do they still want to be a part of France?
I know
do they even have
Martinique.
A choice? Yeah, do they even have a choice? And if so, if they have a choice, are they staying a part of France because it's like actually a good deal? You know, after the hundreds of years of colonization, they're like, actually now we've gotten to a point where it's actually a pretty good deal. Or are they not allowed to leave? You know, like Barcelona, like they're just like, nope. They're like, no, you want to leave, but you can't.
Yeah, Catalan separatism tends to die down whenever the economy's doing less well. Whenever Barcelona starts making more money, they're like Western Australians. They start wanting to leave. That's my 100% accurate analysis of Catalan separatism.
Yeah, Catalan is like WA.
They're like the Western Australians of Spain.
Yeah. So, French colonization is weird. They have their fingers in a lot of stuff still. I guess people don't. So, like, getting into Bitcoin opened up my eyes. And just like,
that's how long it took, like 13 minutes before.
The fucking French have their hands all over fucking Africa. They're still sucking resources out of it. Like, they think like economic colonization. No, there's all this shit going on with like currency. Like, obviously not an economist. I don't know the stuff very well, but like, there's some Central African countries that are actually basically. It seems though they're still just like basically getting wealth funneled out of them to France because of like the monetary policies they have. They still have to like do some weird thing with like the currencies they have to use or whatever. So yeah, the French are still at it, but in a much more like abstract way potentially. You know, there's like less straight up killing people.
I think there are fairly regular military interventions all through France Afrique.
Yeah. There you go.
As well. Some Some
gotta
on
keep
the
the foreign
invitation
legion
of,
sharp,
of the
right?
governments because they're being overrun, I don't know, with Islamic
By rebels
militants
or
or something
whatever.
like that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the French still do play quite an active role in quite a lot of
Yeah.
Africa.
I think they might actually be like the most active colonial or post-colonial, whatever you want to call it, like uh European, what I
Yeah,
guess you call it a state now, like as opposed to an empire. Yeah, which is kind of weird when you think about it, because I don't know, coming from the British, like a British colony, it seems a lot more pacified. And then you look at some of the French stuff and you're like, oh no, actually it's very active for the
yeah,
French. Yeah. So anyways, yeah, back to
yeah,
Fanon.
yeah. Where were we? Oh yeah. So
He ended up in Algiers though.
yeah. So in Martinique, Fanon's family was middle class, and France went to a good school, so they were reasonably well off. In 1940, France fell to the Nazis, and Vichy French naval troops were in Martinique, and Martinique was blockaded. So the Vichy sympathetic troops established a government in Martinique. And it was a pretty oppressive regime. Fanon became more aware of colonial racism, or said that it was just less veiled than it was previously. And Fanon managed to leave Martinique when he was 17 to try to join Gaullist forces, presumably to try to either get rid of the Vichy regime in Martinique or to go fight in Europe. He was too late to join the Free French forces in Dominica, which is where he escaped to. In 43, the pro-Vichy regime in Martinique was deposed, so Fanon returned, and he joined a newly created all-black battalion in the Free French Army. And from here, he went with this battalion to Morocco, Algeria, to France. He was wounded in France fighting. And while he was in Europe, he said he experienced more European racism. So apparently, for example, white women in France who were liberated by black troops preferred to dance with their former fascist captors who were white than with the black soldiers. And then in 45, once the war had finished, Fanon returned to Martinique. He worked on a parliamentary campaign for a communist. Then he left again for France in 45. He studied medicine, psychiatry in Lyon. He wrote plays, qualified as a psychiatrist in 51. And in 52, he published Black Skin, White Masks, that book you mentioned earlier, which is where he analysed the psychological effects of colonialism. So he was writing a lot at this stage. In 53, he moved to Algeria and started practicing psychiatry there in a large hospital. In 1954, the Algerian Revolutionary War started, and Fanon was working at he was still working at a French hospital when the war broke out. And some of the people he treated were French soldiers, some of whom had been carrying out torture of suspected Algerian revolutionaries. He does talk about this in The Wretched of the Earth in, I think it's the final section or maybe the penultimate section where where he's talking about mental health, which is the area of the part of the book I found the most interesting. I thought that was a really interesting part. So some of that was based on his experiences working as a psychiatrist and treating French troops. He eventually joined the National Liberation Front, or the FLN, which was the main nationalist party during the Algerian War. He resigned from his post in the hospital because he couldn't continue to support the French colonial regime it's so openly by working to treat their troops, and was expelled from Algeria in 1957. He moved to Tunis, where he openly joined the FLN. And here he was involved in writing in support of Algerian independence, also wrote, I think, tactics manuals and things like that. He was also travelling across the Sahara, trying to open up a third front in the Revolutionary War. So he was really, really active with the FLN. He was then diagnosed with leukemia. He went to the Soviet Union for treatment, which was partially effective. He achieved partial remission. Returned to Tunis, dictated The Wretched of the Earth, which is, I think, his last work. And it is funny to note, I think most of his books were dictated rather than written. He just didn't like writing much. He liked dictating. And it kind of comes across that way too. In 61, his health was getting worse with the leukemia. On the urging of his comrades, Fanon sought treatment in the US. The CIA arranged for Fanon to be treated at an NIH facility in secret. And then it's unclear what happened. So Fanon went to the US. Some people say that Fanon was kept in a hotel room without treatment until he developed pneumonia. He died in Bethesda, Maryland, in 1961. He was then buried in Algeria in a martyr's graveyard. So that's a sort of a low-resolution view of his life. It is really interesting. And
yeah, extremely interesting.
I read the book before knowing his life story, so I just kind of assumed he was Algerian because he talks so much about Algeria, but no, he wasn't from there. He became very, very caught up in the Algerian independence movement while working there, which does explain some of the parts of the book. So, for example, I was very surprised when he talked about treating French colonial soldiers because I thought, why is he doing that? But it makes more sense in the context of his life.
Yeah, his sometimes you read people, maybe what was that German guy's name? The like Arnold Schwarzenegger of the Second World War.
Oh, Ernst Junger.
Yeah, Ernst Junger.
The German Terminator.
Yeah, he you just like these people embody some. Sorry if there's just crazy wind in the background, getting blown away here. These wind in Hobart. Yeah, like they live the most extreme parts of history, and of course when you see things like you read in the abstract some historical event, well, of course there had to be people actually like a part of that, you know, and that can go for anything. I know, like there were people there when Caesar was murdered, right? It would be amazing to actually know the first-hand account of somebody living through these events, and every now and then they do write a first-hand account, or maybe not a direct account, but have their perspectives on the things, like Junger, or in this case, Fanon. And it's intensely interesting, especially because I think like the 20th century, it feels like, to me at least, the 20th century feels like a bigger century than other centuries historically. Like there's so much crazy shit happening. That might also just be because there's more people writing and capturing the history and all this sort of stuff. But also it does seem as though like with the fall of the colonial empires and stuff in the world wars and then stuff, it seems like a pretty crazy century. And interestingly enough, what I find really interesting about the 20th century is also that like a lot of people like Fanon started creating their perspectives on, like, publishing their perspectives. So if you go further back in history, you get less and less like people publishing in European languages about their perspective as like Africans or as First Nations people or whatever, or women or whatever the group is. And then all of a sudden you have this like 20th century, these like liberation movements and stuff, and you get their perspectives. The other side of the coin is super, super interesting. And I think Fanon, like him, is one of those people that embodies that.
Yeah, he definitely wasn't LARPing. Like he really lived the things he wrote.
Yeah. He wasn't talking about it in the abstract.
No.
Which I find that, like, in the modern context, like having been to university, a metropolitan university in Australia, as an Indigenous person, that I wouldn't call people laughing, but I would say that like a lot
Maybe
of
that's
people,
too rude.
yeah, probably. At least I wouldn't say that of most people, but like maybe some people are, but like that you can almost use indigenous stuff. You can talk about in the abstract, like, oh, there's these statistical things or there's these historical things, but actually, like, you as a person didn't fucking like experience any of this. You just like, it's just like some talking point for you to win your political argument that you're having. And of course, because you're at a university campus, fucking everything is political, right? So you have these people, if they can pull out the indigenous card or something, and like it's like, okay, but do you actually have any like relevant experience of this? Of course, sometimes they like, oftentimes they do, but sometimes they don't. and it just seems like they're talking about in the abstract. It's very intellectual. It's very like, I can pull on whatever like theorists, colonial theorists or whatever, to like explain this thing. It's like, yeah, but all of that's written in an ivory tower. You know, whereas somebody like Fanon, he was literally like going to war for France and dealt with coalface, like, oh, actually, I am a second-class citizen. I can put my life on the line, and I still get treated like this, and that sort of stuff. So yeah, really interesting.
Yeah, and that's one of the parts of the book or aspects of the book that I like the most. In that he was obviously very, very familiar with theory. Like he I presume had read extensively the theoretical underpinnings of revolution. So he was a Marxist. I assume he'd read Capital, etc., etc. But he combined that with very practical knowledge of, yeah, both first fighting for France and then later fighting against France.
Yeah. Yeah, that's also a really interesting juxtaposition. Yeah. You know, and like I can understand why in my case, like here in Australia, why Aboriginal people decide to go and fight in the Second World War and the First World War, particularly the second. But also, like, just like Fanon, treated like second-class citizens. Didn't matter that they went to Europe to fight. They still came back to Australia and was still fucking Australia. And they still got treated like second-class citizens and didn't get like their remunerations and stuff like the white soldiers did. So I can understand, like, there's a lot of parallels. It's not exactly the same, but I can see a lot of parallels. And at least for me, I can understand also a lot of the emotion through the book, like a lot of anger, and yeah, like frustration and that sort of stuff comes through as well.
Yeah,
not to make perfect, like, it's not perfect parallels, obviously, but yeah.
Okay,
so his problem situation.
Oh yeah, let's talk about that.
Yeah,
we've gone over the problem situation.
Yeah, or you can put it in a nutshell.
To an extent, but let's formulate it a bit more concretely.
So, like, you've written a nice question here. He's basically trying to ask the question of, like, how can a colonized people form an independent nation, and independence in a holistic sense, economically, militarily, but interestingly, as a psychologist, he's also thinking like psychological independence. Of the,
he was a psychiatrist. Like, he was actually, he was treating people medically too.
Slash, you know, to the degree that you should not divorce, but think about like the intersection between culture and psychology or psychiatry with people as well. So there's cultural implications. So yeah, really interesting.
It's interesting you brought up culture, actually, because Fanon, I forget who it was. He studied under a radical Catalonian psychiatrist who really, really emphasized the role of culture in the development of psychiatric illness and how it presents. And so Fanon was deeply influenced by that. So he really, really puts culture front and center in terms of the natural history of psychiatric illness.
Which is really interesting, isn't it? Because in the modern context, it's very individualized. And I've got a friend who's a psychologist, and he's trying to bring in his practice or in the stuff that he writes, he tries to bring this more like systems perspective or cultural perspective into like the psychopatho physiology or whatever you want to call it,
Yeah.
or etiology of psychiatric disorders. But to see a Black African / Caribbean psychoanalyst do that as well is a pretty interesting read. Yeah.
It was interesting because he was doing it to himself and also extrapolating from his patients, say his Black patients who had experienced colonization, like extrapolating from that the psychology of one who is colonized. I found really, really interesting. I think probably, well, I mean, it's in part because it's what I find interesting in general, but also because I think it's what he trained in, what he found really, really interesting, what he spent a lot of time thinking about. His description of the psychology of colonialism, I thought, was the most interesting part of this book. There's actually a lot in this book that is interesting, but that was particularly interesting.
Yeah. I think if you maybe, which we can talk about later, like put aside some of the more mechanical interpretations of
that's what I was wanting to bring up next.
Well, we can definitely talk about that. Well, do you want to? What is Fanon's? I'll call it like the misconception of mechanics or something like that. Yeah. What is his misconception that you're concerned about?
Well, so to contextualize it, just mention how this book is written, because a lot of this book is written it feels very conversational, which is why I noted earlier that this book was dictated and then edited. And it feels that way. It feels like Fanon's just talking to you or talking at you.
Because he is.
Yeah, because he just is. That's an accurate feeling when you read this book. A lot of the time what he'll do is he'll walk through sort of hypothetical situations. And I say sort of hypothetical because it's much more concrete than that. He's basically saying, this is what is going to happen when this happens. He offers this roadmap of clear stages, very mechanically, as to what will happen in the process of colonization and the transition from colonization to a war of independence to independence. And that, I mentioned it to you when I saw you in Tasmania in person, that it is what I feel is one of the weaker parts of this book, because in describing these hypotheticals about what Fanon thinks is going to happen, he's very, very categorical in saying, basically, this is how it is going to happen. So when people are put into this situation, they're all going to respond in this way, and their responses will provoke responses in other people that are going to be, again, very mechanically determined. And that mechanistic view of human behavior, particularly assuming that the knowledge of that, a person's knowledge of their mechanical response to a stimulus isn't going to change their response to that stimulus in particular, or that there's no
like him
sort of
writing this is not going
give
to affect
in the system.
It's not going to affect the system.
I mean, having said that, I suppose he would say me writing this and people reading it is what is going to stimulate them to
there
act.
seems to be this like split between, because this is like a very Marxist thing to do. There seems to be this split as either like the thing that I'm writing will accelerate this process. It's inevitable anyways. So because it's inevitable, but we can like write about it or analyze it and accelerate.
Give history a push. Or it's like the inevitability makes it impotent, and me writing about it doesn't affect the outcome. And they just disregard that. So I do think that he follows basically in the tradition of Marx, essentially, and thinkers like him, who just have this, and they have some like structure that they say basically like programs people. In the case of like Marx, it was class. In the case of people like Fanon, it's race, although they're very
I suppose, very closely linked in a colonial context. And this superstructure, and Marx called it class interest. You might call this like caste interest for Fanon's context, because like all of these colonies and stuff have castes, like racial caste systems. Like those interests almost pre-program people to behave, as Jack said, deterministically. And I think maybe like it might be good to actually, for us to program into the show at some point. I know we've said it since the beginning, but actually go and read Hegel and then maybe something substantive of Marx. Because all of this comes from Hegel.
Hegel. It's just such a commitment.
Like all of this basically comes from Hegel. Like he's the root of all this crap, because of his like idea of like trying to like understand historical laws and stuff, and then Marx as well. But that's a conversation for another time.
I guess we can put it to listeners, so we can do it here and then.
How much do you want to see us suffer?
In a more structured way? Because
how much do you want to see Jack and Levi suffer through reading Hegel?
Well, the thing with reading Hegel is we just couldn't do weekly uploads while properly dedicating time to Hegel. We would probably need to take at least a month off from uploads. Or what if we get a handle on Hegel and then report back? So if people, listeners, you can contact us by email or on Discord. Let us know if you really want us to cover an intense book or do a series on the phenomenology of spirit or something like that. Let us know. Like I'm happy to. It just would mean that I can't read that in depth plus other books. It's just not possible.
Or it's the sort of thing that maybe if we started reading it now for 2025 and just like dip into it. So the anti-Oedipus, or I think it's just
called that is another level if we did anti-Oedipus.
Yeah, it just arrived. And god damn it, my girlfriend likes to open my packages from Amazon when they arrive. It's so annoying. I'm like, I want to open them. She's like, no, I'm going to open them. And I don't get that little dopamine hit from Uncle Jeff. No, so she opens it. I get back home from my trip to New South Wales and I go, I'm looking forward to opening this package. God damn it, it's already open. Anyways, anti-Oedipus is there. That's going to be a battle. Like Hegel would be a battle, phenomenology of the spirit. Probably Capital would be a battle as well. Although Jack's already read it, so maybe
Capital's not as.
It's just very long.
Capital, it's long. Capital's much more concrete than capitalism and schizophrenia or the phenomenology of spirit. It can be pretty dry in places, but it's not. It's all right actually.
The only reason why I suggest those two in particular, and maybe like a Deleuze or like a Foucault book or something, is because they're just incredibly influential. And when we read these other thinkers, like it might just be good to have done an episode on them. Anyways, email us if you want to, or contact us on Twitter. Jack occasionally checks the Twitter. Have you been? You've been on it a bit more recently though.
More occasionally. I should do it more.
That's Jack at bookclubfromhell.com or Levi at bookclubfromhell.com if you want to email us.
I would be very open to covering the capitalism and schizophrenia, or at least one book of that. Doing both would be,
or maybe just one chapter.
An ordeal. I then cut through like 10 pages of anti-Oedipus and just completely forgot where I was because I don't know how I got here. I've just profound amnesia as to how I got to this page.
Speaking of amnesia, should we get back to Fanon? So
that was a brilliant segue, getting us back on track. Yeah. So the problem situation is how do you get independence for colonized people? And like we were saying, the bit I found most interesting was actually how do you psychologically get independence? Because he talks about the psychology of a colonized person and what the psychology of a successfully decolonized person would look like.
Yeah. Very interesting. Very interesting. So the problem situation was also like diagnosing, I suppose, doctor, right? Or a psychoanalyst, I suppose. He would consider himself
he did medicine. Psychiatrists are doctors.
Yeah. Exactly. Like don't get smart with me, Levi. They're doctors, motherfucker.
They're the weirdest doctors.
Yes. Yeah, they're doctors.
The most interesting doctors I've met are almost always psychiatrists because they're really fucking weird.
Yeah, yeah. Yes. So, what was I going to say? Yeah. So he's coming at it from like diagnose some stuff, but also maybe come up with like a prognosis, I suppose.
Mm.
And putting aside the mechanical issues or the deterministic fallacy that Jack's noted, we can put that to the side and like discuss the rest of the book. What do you reckon?
Yeah, I just want to add, with respect to the deterministic thing, my guess is that Fanon or other people who have a more Marxist view of history would say that maybe an individual, there'll be variation in how they'll respond to certain things, but in aggregate, if you have a large enough number of people, their response is going to average out to something that will approximate this mechanistic view.
Yeah, yeah.
I guess that's what they'd say to that.
Maybe one way they'd put it. Yeah, or given that he's being conversational as well, he's dictating the book. Maybe if you were having a conversation with him, it would come across as more like hypothetical. It would seem like he'd be able to respond. Oh, maybe there's different ways it could unfold, but here's what I think will happen. And it would be less,
came across in the
less
book.
categorical. But that's because he's just dictating. He doesn't have anybody to like actually like follow up and ask him, "Oh, do you think there's any alternatives?" That sort of stuff. So it might also be just a consequence of it being the way that he wrote it as well.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It could well be that.
And the last caveat as well is that it was originally written in French and we're reading an English translation. So I don't know how much of that like nuance or might have been lost. And in the original French, maybe you can see a little bit more. There might be less categorical language. We don't know. We don't speak French. So,
yeah,
whatever.
But I would be very surprised. Like it'd be a real problem with the translation if they rendered the indicative into the conditional into the indicative in English.
Yeah, that'd be pretty bad.
That'd be like you'd just be making a mistake. Like you've just not done your job properly.
Yeah. So, okay, cool. So, where should we go to next? What is colonialism?
Yeah. In terms of how we structure this, it's probably worth dividing it into what is colonialism.
Yep.
And going over the features of colonialism as a diagnosis. And then we can go on to how to decolonize as treatment if we're going to torture the psychiatric metaphor a bit further. So in terms of what is colonialism, features of colonialism, an image he uses regularly in this book to describe colonialism is that of a Manichaean world.
So what is Manichaean? That's very strange.
I know so little.
I have to look into it.
Yeah, I know little about Manichaeanism. Beyond that, it's a very old religion where I think the world is a continuous battleground between the binary forces of good and evil, and they're constantly butting heads.
Yeah.
And Fanon says that the colonial world is one in which the white colonizers are always good and the black colonised are always bad. And this is not merely reflected in the laws, but it's reflected in the psychology of people too.
Yeah.
And not merely reflected in the psychology of colonisers who feel themselves to be good, but actually the colonised too feel on some level that they are bad and that they might not like how they're treated, but on some level they feel that they deserve it or it's natural or right. And this comes up a lot, this Manichaean metaphor.
Yeah. It's really the good and evil stuff, right? This like quite binary view of the world. Yeah, I think it's interesting. I like the use of the word. I get what he's saying, even if I don't know jack about anything to do with Manichaeanism in like the actual religion. Cool. So, what is colonialism? What do we reckon? That's my question to you, Jack. What is colonialism? Yeah.
Because it is...
According to Fanon. Yeah, obviously.
According to Fanon, I think he'd define it as quite concretely when one country and a military power, because it's always enforced through violence, when one country through might of arms, occupies the territory of another country, imposes its culture, imposes its forms of governance, and very importantly, exports its people to that territory. And its people are the ones who rule. And the original inhabitants of that territory are an underclass. And it can be... Fanon doesn't go over this, but the way he talks about it seems to indicate that he thinks it's going to be explicit, the underclass nature of the...
And when he was writing it was...
Yeah, well, that's what, like, when he was writing about it, like in Algeria, for example, it was very, very explicit.
And if you speak to a lot of indigenous people or Africans or Creoles in colonial or post-colonial 20th, 1st century countries, they will still say that it is extremely explicit. Like, and it might not be necessarily imposed through the same force as it was historically, or but like, anyways, let's
So that's, I think, I imagine that's Fanon's idea of colonialism. It's quite concrete. I think the military and the force aspect is very important, because he talks regularly about how colonialism only understands force, and the only way to remove it is to also speak the language of force.
Yeah, I suppose the thing... Sorry, go on.
No. Also, I was just going to say, I have heard other definitions of colonialism where it entering into some sort of situation with cultural assumptions that might be at variance with those of other people are described as colonialism. I'm not sure that that's how Fanon would have seen it.
I wonder if he'd change his perspective today if he saw the way that things have unfolded. Because now there's much more subtle forms. You know, like, for example, the French currency stuff in Central Africa and North Africa. Like, that seems pretty extractive and exploitative and completely based on the colonial history of Africa under the French. But it's not necessarily... Well, actually, they might actually say that it actually is enforced through violence, like, because if they don't agree to it, then there'll be like economic sanctions on them and stuff. So maybe African people living in that part would actually say, actually, it is coercive. And Fanon would just still say, yeah, that's still violent.
Yeah, and we'll put a dog ear on that, talking about Fanon's use of the term violence.
Or the threat of violence, like the implied threat that, oh, if you don't comply with this, like, at the end of the day, you go far enough back and they can bring in a bunch of troops with guns and enforce what they need.
Or even just, if you don't do what we want, we will make you poorer.
Poorer, yeah. Yeah, we will make you suffer. Which is a pretty fucking concrete form of violence. Like, if I can starve you, like, sure, I'm not putting a gun to your head, but it's a form of violence.
Yeah, it's physical coercion a step removed. But the end point is still very concrete. Yeah.
Yeah. Anyways, so that's interesting. I wonder... Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Okay, cool.
Does your conception of colonialism differ from Fanon's? Or at least from what I read as Fanon's definition of colonialism?
Yeah, I think, like, I'd take a slightly broader conception of it, because, and he talks a bit about religion, say, for example, like, there's a lot of stuff that happened in Australia, especially post sort of like 1800, and then especially post Federation, that was, I guess you could always conceptualize it as still coercive in some level, but a lot of it was more about, like, deculturation and, like, destruction of language, and that, like, so, like, forcing people to, like, learn English and then, like, outlawing them. I guess that's still violent. So, like, let me see if I can find an example where there's not, like, some very explicit violence at the end of it. Yeah, so I guess a slightly more subtle form of it is like the implied, like, paternalism of the relationship between Indigenous peoples and in maybe not, like, specific, like, I'll talk about, like, in general, I'm talking about, like, white Australians. I don't know, like, my like interactions with other people, like other immigrant communities and stuff. But, like, in an institutional context, there's like this infantilizing aspect of it. There's like indigenous peoples are like needy and poorer and uneducated and need to be like constantly helped and stuff. And obviously there are issues and they're important and they need to be dealt with, but it's this kind of like all pervasive asymmetry in the relations between like Aboriginal communities in Australia and like post-federation institutions. And I don't know if it's necessarily violent, but it's this it's not taking people seriously. You know, like one of the key things that like the last 100 years or so of like suffragettes and civil rights and stuff has forced the world to do, the colonies to do, is like, hey, take people seriously. Like they've got a perspective on this. Just because you're European or from a European background institution doesn't mean that you're automatically like, you know, more than this other community. There's this pervasive assumption in the institutions that I don't necessarily characterize that as violence. It's like a much softer, pervasive asymmetry in how seriously people are taken. And then, you know, like even, you know, like a good example is like the Mabo case, like Mabo versus State of Queensland. It's like
for non-Australian listeners, just really quickly, can you give like
okay, so the high level overview, and maybe there's going to be some Australians that are going to disagree with me with what I'm about to say, but fuck you. Like,
get your own podcast.
Yeah, like Australia was founded on this idea of what the British called terra nullius. The doctrine of terra nullius it means like no man's land or something, like the land of no people or something in Latin. And the doctrine of terra nullius is like, under British colonial law, was basically saying like, if you arrive at a land and you declare it terra nullius and you find that there's nobody who's actually living there, like, you know, in a way that you'd consider like if the land belongs to them, you declare it terra nullius, and then it changes the way that you have to interact with people, or that the colonialists had to interact with people. That was a lie. Like, it's just a lie. It wasn't. And it took until like the Mabo versus State of Queensland, which I think was literally in the like, when was it? I don't know, like I was about to say the 90s, but I don't want to say the 90s and get it wrong. Yeah, well, it was 92. There 92. You go. It was 92. So it took until 1992. Like, we're talking literally 200 years and 91 years of federation for like under Australian law, which is still like a British, like it's still like we're a British colony.
It's
and
common law system,
the common law system, and all that sort of stuff. It took until 1992 for like that false doctrine to be overturned, and it had to be overturned by a Torres Strait Islander going to the Supreme Court or the High Court of Queensland. So it wasn't enough for the people who live there in the first place to just say, hey, we own this land. We've always owned this land. Just because we don't put picket fences around the stuff doesn't mean we don't have like a sense of ownership and like our own institutions of ownership. They had to take it to the colonizer, to the colonizing institutions, courts of law, and prove under their system that the doctrine was false, or that the doctrine was violated, and that the original premise of the colony was false. So, like, to me, that's just like rank colonialism. Why does, if these people are the original people and they've always been there for like before like the European colonizers came, why do they have to justify themselves under the colonial powers court of law? To me, this is like completely fucking irrelevant. But that speaks to the asymmetry that we live under. It's like the Queenslanders didn't have to go to Torres Strait Islanders or to like the Aboriginal people living in mainland Queensland and say like justify their point. The people who were colonized had to do it inside the context, the institutional context of the colonizing country.
I guess I'll be Fanon bot.
Yeah,
and try to.
That still might be violent. That still might be
a response to that exact. I was about to say the reason why Eddie Mabo had to come to the like the colonisers' court is because ultimately the colonisers' court is backed up by overwhelming physical force.
Yeah.
And Mabo isn't.
Yeah, exactly. So
I guess that's probably the Fanon response.
Yeah, and maybe you can't get away from that. Maybe just the very nature of colonialism. Like, if you sort of ran history in your head a different way and thought, like, what if the Europeans came to Australia and when they landed, like, La Perouse or like Philip or whoever, they landed and they were like, oh, there's people here. Okay, well, why don't we, try to do this peacefully and set up, like trade and all that sort of stuff. And like, I don't see why in principle that couldn't have happened. But would you call that colonization? Like, could you get to a point where like, oh, actually there's been there's a colony there in Australia, in Sydney, like Port Botany or whatever, and it's not growing through like physical expansion and military expansion, but it's maybe like growing through like commerce and intercultural exchange and stuff. That idea is that didn't happen, as far as I'm aware, anywhere on the planet. Certainly didn't happen in Australia. But I don't see why it couldn't have in principle happened. But to me, that doesn't even sound like colonization. That sounds, but maybe technically it would be somebody setting up a colony. I don't know. Maybe like there's this like inherent overtone just because of the history of actual colonization that it turns out that there's no way that it can't be violent.
Yeah, at least within the cultural context of Europe at the time, that was basically how Europeans interacted with everyone, including each other. It was just such a violent place.
And there still is a lot of violence as well.
Yeah, like in principle, it didn't have to be violent. It's just given the cultural context.
Yeah.
It almost just feels like it had to be.
But is it even possible to like, quote unquote, create a colony? Like, okay, us Australians are going to start sending, I don't know, people to Wellington, and we're just going to start buying up land in Wellington, and then be like, this is now Australia. This little patch of Wellington, this is now Australia. Like, how would New Zealanders respond? They'd probably be like, go fuck yourself.
Would a big difference, though, be if Australians were doing that, that's within the current New Zealand legal system? And I guess we'd have to ignore.
So
it's within the context of New Zealand rather than Australia coming over. Like this example, the wheels sort of fall off because Australia and New Zealand are so similar.
Well, no, because what the premise of what the Mabo case was saying is like you ignored, like it'd be like us going to New Zealand, setting up some stuff, and then ignoring the New Zealand legal system, and then being like, no, we don't care about your property rights system, and we don't care about your like that stuff. This part of the land that we've taken, that's now Australian law, and like there's this like ignoring, because like in Australia, for example, and everywhere else where there was colonization, there were laws there. There were laws and institutions. They just got ignored and pretended that like, they didn't exist.
Well, they were the wrong ones.
They were the wrong ones.
British.
Yeah, or French, or Czech. No, not Czech.
They turn up and they were just Union Jacks hanging from gum trees. It's like, oh, I recognize this. I know where we stand.
There's rabbits. Like all of Tasmania has just been like terraformed to like. So if you come to Tassie, the one there's rabbits that somebody introduced to Tasmania because he wanted to shoot rabbits. But there's also things like there's
that happened in Victoria too.
Yeah, there's blackberries, because apparently like Europeans were like which I don't know if it was the Dutch or if it was the British, like we're like, oh, okay, this looks like a good place to put blackberries. So they just started just like, as they walked around, they like chucked blackberry seeds and stuff around. And now Hobart is just not Hobart, but Tasmania is just like overrun by these fucking blackberries. Which is nice if you like blackberries, but it's horrible if you want to just like go for a walk and not just get into a sprawling mess of thorns. And there's a whole bunch of other terraforming that they did. Why am I talking about this?
Okay, how about this?
Yeah.
So from what you were saying earlier, do you think invasion is necessary for colonization? So invasion as in moving troops or some sort of agents of force into an area to establish the dominance of one group.
Yeah, it has to be. Because if you're going to come onto somebody else's land and then just create your own law and ignore their institutions and their law, how do you expect to do that without being able to push back violently in some way?
Yeah.
To me, that seems like inherently confrontational. I don't see how you get away from that being some sort of like annexation in essence. I just don't see like, okay, we've got some land now and our laws, and we're just going to like push our laws and institutions and people off that land. Like, how is that not inherently violent or confrontational?
Yeah. And there are a bunch of things that would be good to talk about. How about we go through what Fanon said, and then we can talk about it more generally, because there are so many jumping off points here.
Yeah, and also pull me into line if I'm getting too off topic with this and stuff, because this is the first Indigenous explicitly like colonial thing. So I don't know, like every now and then I might pop up with a remark in other episodes, but like this is an episode where there was that fucking like glacial fucking bullshit.
Yeah, but that was just completely frivolous. This is a real book. Like, this is a book I take seriously.
Yeah. So obviously, if I get too offline, just like tap me and be like, all right.
No, I want to talk about things more broadly. Let's talk about Fanon.
Sure.
Specifically for half an hour.
Yeah.
I brought this up because I was about to ask something that was non-Fanon, but is on the topic of colonialism.
Let's get back to Fanon a bit.
Yeah, and I'll put a pin in that and do it later. So that brings us around to Fanon's idea of violence and how colonialism is fundamentally maintained by violence. Because, like you said, he viewed colonialism as only speaking the language of violence. It's only coercive because it's interacting with people who don't necessarily want to live in a colonialist system. So you need some way of keeping them in line. And this ranges from frank violence, so you have troops with guns. So that's very obvious. All the way down to much more subtle things like the psychological state inculcated by generations of being colonized, which it's not immediately maintained by someone pointing a gun at you, but the situation that gives rise to that psychological state can only exist with physical force, or at least under the threat of physical force. It's also his definition of violence. So, like I said at the beginning of this episode, I had heard of Fanon, at least some people saying that he only viewed things as being created by and soluble through violence. It's probably true to an extent. It's just important to note how he defined violence. So he didn't only define violence as hitting someone over the head with a rock. It's not just physical. I think probably a better rendering of what he describes as violence is coercion. So in some way forcing someone to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do.
Yeah.
I guess you could then push back and say it's like if you go enough steps back, that is ultimately going to find a point of threatening to physically harm someone. But
yeah, like for example, like economic sanctions. Like the reason why you can enforce economic sanctions is because behind the economic sanctions is like a navy or whatever that can blow up your ships en route to do trade.
Yeah, because
so eventually it does come back to
international statements don't really mean anything unless you've got an army backing you up.
Yeah, exactly. You can't sanction like pick your country. You can't sanction it unless you've got Russia, China, or the US to enforce, or NATO to enforce the sanctions. So sure.
Because I guess in some cases, if you control the technology, like for example with the SWIFT banking system, how following the invasion of Ukraine, Russia was removed from that. I guess in some cases, if a country or an organization controls a technology, they can remove groups from it without a military backing them up. But even then, I guess you could say if you go far enough back, the reason why the affected country doesn't just invade and seize the technology is because there is some sort of objective physical force defending it. Yeah.
At some point, there has to be kinetic
physical
energy or the threat
violence.
of the kinetic energy that can like destroy bodies. So
Mm.
and infrastructure and stuff. Yeah. Eventually, are we being too reductive? You know, I don't know. Maybe we're like trapped in this like local maxima.
We've been mind broken by Fanon.
But at the end of the day, like, yeah,
Maybe
I don't know.
I'm an idealist in that I think that there is actually at the step even above violence, are actually the ideas motivating it. The being able to enact your will kinetically is extremely important. Of course, it's so obvious as to sound sort of absurd when you say it out loud. But I think even more important than that are the ideas motivating it. Even if you just view it in terms of how effective is the violence. So if you can organize a large number of people to enact the same kinetic aims, which requires some sort of idea to organize them, that's far more effective than just one person doing it.
Yeah,
So
I guess like on some level, all of human action is downstream of the ideas that people have, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, even the idea that in principle, I can get what I want because I have the ability to focus and leverage a huge amount of kinetic energy. Or in the modern era, it'd be like also just blasting people with huge amounts of heat and radiation if you just want to, you know, pull out the nuclear thing. But you know, the idea that I can use that to get my way is, and that I should do that because of some overarching ideology, whether it's like Western liberalism or the supremacy of the US, or pick your larger narrative. The threat of violence exists. I guess I'm asking you. You're saying that like the threat or the implied threat of being able to use physical violence, it exists within like larger ideological narratives about why you should or shouldn't and what justifies the use of that violence.
Yeah, but also even the organizing body of violence. So for in the case of the Algerian war that took up so much of Fanon's mental bandwidth, say France is ultimately an idea.
Yeah.
And so that's concretely in terms of colonial wars, like France is the organizing structure for violence. That's what allows it to be effective at scale versus just some random person going to the idea of Algeria and going, oh, well, it's mine now.
The French, what do you call it? Like identity, I suppose, or the existence,
a collection of ideas. But this is also just a first principle of mine, culture, in that I think human action is motivated by ideas and
like value
those ideas
and
ideas both in terms of what you're trying to optimize for and how you do it. I view those as upstream of human action. Yeah, influenced by human action, of course.
If you put in that framework, like my first principles or like two of my first principles I can think of explicating right now would be like, people have two things at the very least. They have an explanation of the world, and then they have a second thing, which is, given that explanation, how should they behave within that world? So there's kind of, I don't think it's about one taking precedence over the other. I wouldn't frame it like that. I'd say they're two interrelated things. Is that, like, for example, you can make somebody change the way that they think they should behave if you modify their explanation, if you get them to like change their explanation of the world. But simultaneously, like, people can learn a lot about or change their explanation of their world based on like behaving some way, and then their idea of the way they should behave actually turns out wrong. And then they have to update their explanation. And so I think these are like two, like the normative and the explanatory, I think, like exist, these idea structures are the two, like, at least in my head, like two foundational lenses through which to like think about what's happening in society.
Yeah, and it's individual, variant between individuals, how much their model of the world updates based on experience.
Yeah, and also their culture. Like, some cultures are extremely stagnant and enforce stasis and enforce like conformity and stuff, and other cultures are much more open and allow people to play with ideas and like question norms, and, you know, like even the idea of having like modernist art that like breaks rules and stuff. There's plenty of cultures where you're not allowed to break rules. Like in Islamic art, like hundreds of years, you don't break fucking rules in like what you can depict and stuff. Whereas like in the last century in Europe, there's been a number of like artistic
Danish
movements,
cartoonists.
yeah, who have like said, actually, no, we think that we are allowed to depict certain things. Fuck you.
Yeah.
So okay, so should we get back to Fanon?
Yeah. So I think we've gone over violence.
Yeah, we've covered it.
That
Should we substitute?
That's a really foundational idea, but I think it's better as coercion.
Coercion or the implied ability to use coercion.
Yeah, because I guess it's coercion in the same way as paying a parking ticket. It's like you don't want to pay it. The reason you do it is because if you go enough steps back, there's someone who's going to kick you in the head if you don't pay it.
Yeah, exactly. So that's what we mean by violence. That's what we're going to use as our substitute for violence.
Yeah, or when we say violence, that's what we mean, and what I anticipate Fanon meant.
Yeah.
What else do we want to say, at least from Fanon's perspective, about what constitutes colonialism? We could talk about the colonial mindset, actually, in terms of... So he calls them natives, and he says that a native...
Oh, yeah, this is an interesting point, yeah.
Yeah, is a colonized person. And once a group achieves independence, and this means psychological independence as well, because he noted that there are a few places which achieved political independence from France but still remained economically or psychologically dependent on them, that colonialism was maintained there. He didn't consider them truly independent. But if you become truly independent, you're no longer a native. You're just a national of whatever country you're from. So the status of being a native is really important in Fanon's conception of colonialism. I guess to an extent that's what you were talking about earlier, the not taking Indigenous Australians seriously.
Yeah. That
could be part of being a native in Fanon's paradigm.
Yeah, see, it's interesting, isn't it? Because if you track most areas back far enough in history, at some point, obviously at some point there was an original people who ended up there. If it's like at some point back in the migratory history out of Africa, there was a first people to like go through, I don't know, like Indonesia or whatever. But the chances of them being actually in the modern context descendants of those original people is almost zero. I think it's essentially zero, because
descendant is one thing, but also like the culture, you can't expect the culture to be
over the course of 100,000 years
after that long,
like 100,000 years or something. Like, when was migration out of Africa? Like 150,000 years ago or something. And maybe people have been in a country like Australia for, like the oldest things are like 60,000 years. But maybe, the actual earliest arrival was like 80,000 years. And then maybe there was a second wave or something. And like Aboriginal people now, like in the modern context, might be descendants of like later waves of migration. So like, a really good example of this is like, I'm not going to get too much into this topic, but like the current conflict in Palestine, there's like idea of like who's indigenous to the area. And it's like, are the Jews? It's like, well, Judaism predates like Islam, so they've got a pretty strong case. But if you go back far enough in history, you get to like the Bronze Age and stuff, and actually there are a bunch of tribes there, and there are a bunch of people. And if you go back before then, it's like proto-Semitic people before even like what we'd consider Semitic languages even existed. There are a bunch. So does anybody exist in that area in the current context that you can say actually can like say that they're descendant of pre-Bronze Age people of that area? Probably not. And so the idea of indigeneity, actually, when you start like pulling it apart, I think becomes extremely like, I don't even know if it's helpful. And this is me saying this as an Indigenous person, and maybe like Fanon's conception of it as like, okay, you've got a colonial power that comes in, and whoever the people were there first, from the perspective of the colonizer, is the native people. And actually, that's all you really need. You don't need to like go into this like how long have they been there and all this sort of stuff. It's this matter of like at the point of historical interface between these two peoples, there's the colonizer and there's the native. And like actually, that's a fairly simple framework, and it's actually useful.
Yeah, within the Manichaean order of colonialism, I guess Fanon would say the native is the bad and the colonizer is the good in that Manichaean sense.
Because often the colonizers also, as you're talking about, like in terms of like ideas, or as I was saying, like normative and explanatory structures, like oftentimes the colonizers also had ideas around like spreading Christianity or like what do they call it? Like manifest destiny and stuff like that. Like these other ideas of like, yeah, we're doing the natives a favor. We're spreading civilization. We're, whatever. So there was, I would agree with him that at least historically, the colonizing in the British and French context, and for what the little I know of the French context, it seems that way. I know as an Indigenous person, and like my ex-partner was also Creole Mauritian, and so like a lot of my knowledge of like the French African experience has been informed by that relationship. It seems as though like I feel as though what Fanon is capturing is somewhat accurate. I think it's changed now. I'd actually say there's almost like a reversal happening in Australia now, at least in metropolitan Australia. But historically, I would agree with what he's saying.
Agree in terms of the psychology.
Yeah.
Of what he called natives. Yeah.
The natives are savage. They're uncivilized. They are, a good example is like in New South Wales, right? Where I'm from, South Coast. My family's from the South Coast of New South Wales. The particular tribe, or like, I don't know, tribe, language group, whatever. I don't know what the right terminology is these days. Called the Yuin. So Yuin peoples of the South Coast of New South Wales is part of my ancestry. And the religious group, or the religion was this kind of, it's sort of like animism, if you've ever heard of Dreamtime stories, but in particular, there's like one particular like creator spirit, which might be like analogous to Elohim, which is called Bayami, the creator spirit, which is more abstract. So a lot of people, their exposure to Dreamtime stuff will be like, oh, there were these two birds, like, and because of their interaction, they created this like rock formation or something like that. Or like the Three Sisters story of like being in the stars and I don't know, whatever, creating like the rocks or whatever. So like it'll be some like animist mythology, but then Bayami is this more abstract, much more closely like it's not necessarily a specific animal associated with Bayami. It's more like this like diffuse sort of creator spirit, like Elohim, or like in Tolkien's mythology, he had the Maya, the creator spirits, and then he had like the thing above the Maya. I can't remember what he called it. And I always found it interesting that they were referred to by the colonialists as the cult of Bayami. It's like, motherfuckers, you came here. You're the cult. You're bringing your religion here. Like the cult of Jesus Christ has taken it upon themselves to bring their religion here. Why are we the cult? Why is Bayami the cult? Like it's not like it's not a cult. It's a religion, just like your religion is a religion. But no, when it's the colonizer like analyzing our culture here, all of a sudden we're the cult and we're the weird ones. But it's like, we didn't travel halfway across the world to impose the cult of Bayami on you and make you learn our language and so forth. So why are we the cult? Seems like you've got a lot more cultish behaviors than us. So I don't know, like, I shouldn't put it, I'm dropping into the us versus them mentality. I shouldn't do that. I'm sorry. It's like, I'll try not to do that. So yeah, that's just one example of like these like tacit things where it's like, it's always the Australian narrative. By the way, we were talking about this online listeners. Like, this is actually the first time that like Jack and I have probably spoken about this stuff. Like, we've managed to go like 12 years as friends or something, and it's just never really been like, we briefly discussed it one time, like 8 years ago or something, and it was like a 2-second conversation, I remember. But the rest of our friendship, we just do weird stuff and talk about the gym or whatever. But like, yeah, so it's interesting talking to you about it. But like, for example, Discover. I still hear like my friends, my like partner, like whatever, like their family will talk about like Australia being discovered by Europeans. You can't discover something where there's already people there. Like this idea of discovery is within this cultural framework of like the European perspective is what matters. It's like if you arrive somewhere, there's people already there, you didn't discover it. That's just like irrelevant term, but a lot of white Australians, especially if you go outside of like metropolitan Sydney or Melbourne, that's still how they think. I think, oh, Australia was discovered in 1778 or whatever the hell. No, it wasn't. You can't discover something where there's already people.
So 60,000 years. Right?
It's you're a little late to the party. It's only discovery if you think that either people didn't exist there or that the people that did exist there are somehow less, their perspective and their experience and their institutions and their language and their law and their history and their traditions don't matter as much for whatever reason. So there's all these like subtle implicit things that growing up as an Indigenous person in Australia, and it's like constantly just, okay, no, that's not right. You didn't discover it. No, it's not right that like we're a cult and your thing gets to be a religion. Like, no, it's not right that like your conception, like I have to go to your court and like overturn your doctrine of terra nullius. Like there are all these things that just like it's constant. It's always there. It's always there in the background. And it's this overarching implicit like asymmetry of the conception of the history and the place of people of Indigenous people in Australia.
Yeah, because Fanon would definitely identify that as how colonisers think.
Yeah.
He interestingly also talked about how natives have internalized this to a large extent.
Yeah.
Like, did you feel for you or for people around you that had been internalized too?
Yeah. So it definitely happens. Like, okay, as people would know, I'm not religious. And I have very strong feelings about that. And part of the reason why those strong feelings have been formed is because like my family were like put on missions and stuff in New South Wales and they were forced to learn English. And there were these things like in New South Wales as late as the 60s, maybe it wasn't the 60s, man, I'm misquoting that, but like there are these things like you could get off the mission as an Aboriginal person if you agreed under certain circumstances to like you had to like sign a contract with the New South Wales government to like stop identifying as Aboriginal, to not speak the language, to and your local language and so forth. And then you could if you wanted to get off the mission, you had to de-identify and deculturate. So sorry, the original question was, oh yeah, is that some, yeah. So then I see like, and those missions were run by different sects of Christians. And, you know, some of them were worse than others. Like there's one called, like Foursquare. I think that's called Foursquare. Like they're pretty like fire and brimstone and stuff, like pretty grim. There's obviously the Calvinists and stuff. And then there's like slightly less intense, but as far as I'm concerned, any mission sucks. But there's still people in like northern New South Wales and the coast, deeply Christian Aboriginal communities. And I'm not going to tell them not to be Christian, but it's also like, well, by deeply Christian, I mean like in WA, there's like Aboriginal communities that like will consider like traditional or like pre-European spirituality, like devil worship. They call it devil worship. And the people who are destroying like artifacts that somebody like myself would consider, hey, like there's this artifact that you found, like you might not have that religion now, but it's like historically important, like maybe we should preserve it or whatever. Well, the people who are destroying the artifacts are Aboriginal people. They're not like Europeans now. It's Aboriginal people who are destroying the artifacts because they're Christianized and they consider it like bad for whatever reason. And to me, that's an extreme example of like these Indigenous people who have completely adopted the colonizing religion. In this case, and that's still happening today. Like the things I just referenced, like those things, the last time I read about those sorts of things was only a couple of years ago. So like artifacts being destroyed because they're like devil worship artifacts and stuff. Whereas like you go to say like the Yolngu in like northeast Arnhem Land or something, they find an artifact, they will instantly like put it under like high quality well, not necessarily, but like depending on the artifact, they might try to preserve it if it's not all the time, like obviously, but like they might actually realize, like, oh, actually this is something that's really important, like we want to preserve it or whatnot, or like put in a library or like a family whatever home or whatnot. They won't want to destroy it, even though they are Christian. Like there's a lot of Christians up there as well. But so there's like a scale of like how much this has like the people have like internalized this like sense of like colonizer culture good, colonizer religion good, colonizer institutions good, pre-colonizer religion devil worship, pre-colonizer institution invalid, pre-colonizer language bad. So I personally have seen a whole spectrum of this stuff just because I've traveled a fair bit and like I know Aboriginal people from like across the country, and there's a very, very big range of like, like some people, for example, would consider me extremely colonized, which is fine. In part because like I speak English, I don't speak my ancestors' language. Don't really have that much access to it. But there's language revival movements in New South Wales and Victoria, and those people would consider themselves quote unquote decolonizing, which is actually an important. Sorry, can I get one more point and then like I'll stop talking?
Yeah.
I just feel like I've been going on for ages. There's one really interesting thing is like decolonization in the modern context, where Fanon, some people wouldn't necessarily agree with him, is like language revival. Say for a community like the Wiradjuri in the middle of New South Wales, they're setting up language revival. People are learning Wiradjuri language, trying to reconstruct it to the degree that they can. Actually, for people who want to go and look, there's a Wiradjuri language dictionary done by like people like Stan Grant, I think, who's an important Australian Aboriginal like academic. Which, if you want to see like what an Australian Aboriginal language is like, it's pretty interesting. Like it's very different to European languages.
Very, very foreign.
Yeah, it's very different. So like the Wiradjuri language dictionary, they actually have like an elder saying the words, so you can click play this word, how does it pronounce and stuff. They would consider that community would consider that like a form of decolonization, because they're not only speaking through the colonizers' language. They're actually like they're reconstructing, they're claiming back their language, they're getting their language back, and they're using that, and they would consider that a non-violent form of decolonization and important, but psychological in Fanon's. Yeah, it's like an important part of like psychological decolonization, but it's not necessarily violent.
Yeah, that's true.
Did I answer your question, or did I just ramble?
Yeah, the question was about internalization in Fanon's telling of colonial concepts, or of that Manichaeanism. And yeah, like you basically answered yes.
Yeah, the short answer is yes, it does happen. To different degrees and in different ways.
Which other aspects of colonialism that Fanon described do you want to talk about, or should we go on to how to decolonize?
There was an interesting one, I think, to talk about. There's like the native, he called it like, there's like the lumpen proletariat.
The lumpen proletariat.
There's the intellectual native. Is that what he called them? The intellectual native. And there's another class of natives. Let's see if I can find it that he came up with. So he came up with this idea that there's actually kind of like different types of natives in response to the colonization. And where are my book club?
Yeah, because he talked about how there are peasants which make up most natives, and these are to some extent actually less colonized than the lumpen proletariat, so the lumpen proletariat in Marxism is a working underclass who have no class consciousness and are oftentimes quite reactionary. And so Fanon says you have these people who live kind of on the outskirts of cities.
Yeah, native
Within
workers.
cities, you've got a small group of intellectuals or middle-class natives who are very, very colonized and will oftentimes defend colonialism very strongly and really identify with it. Try to only speak the colonial language, learn colonial culture. And then you've got most of the native population who live out rurally, so they're the peasantry, and maintain native religion, native language, and don't actually have that much to do with the cities. So he said that there was a slightly different class structure in colonies than there was in, say, Germany and the United Kingdom that Marx described in the 19th century.
I think it's interesting. Sorry, you were going to say something.
No, that was all.
I think that was one of the really interesting things for me because, presumably, if he met if Fanon met me, he'd probably class me as a native intellectual potentially, and because I like certain aspects of the West, and so I guess I just found that personally that was very interesting. I think, though, that was also one of the parts where I realized, oh, actually, there's a very different situation in Africa as well, because tried to look into it, obviously, very complex history, lots of people and all that sort of stuff. But there seems to also be, this very crazy, if you just push back against this whole Manichean, is that how you pronounce it? Manichean?
I think it's Manichean, but
I'll go with Manichean.
I'm not sure.
Manichean worldview of colonizers good, natives bad, or these days in your left wing circles, it'll be the opposite. It'll be natives good, the noble savage stuff, and the white people bad. Colonizers and white saviors and stuff. But both of those perspectives are wrong, because there's good people and there's bad people regardless of skin color, and definitely you can see that. I've seen it in my communities, bastards that I wouldn't want running any institution. I don't care if they're Aboriginal or white or whatever. And inversely, we know you can pick your favorite politician in Australia. And the same thing in Africa. There's plenty. You can look at African political corruption and stuff. It's just okay, so there's really terrible political corruption amongst Black Africans, especially in the last 30 or 40 years post colonization movements. And I don't really think that it's not necessarily helpful to think of oh, this person, they're an intellectual, native intellectual, or a colonized intellectual, because they're adopting certain things about the colonizer that will make them bad. Somebody could adopt certain ideas from a colonizing culture because they're good ideas, but also somebody could adopt those ideas and use them poorly, in the case of a lot of the corruption and stuff. So yeah, I don't necessarily think it's that simple. I always feel these kind of categorizations of people that sort of Marxists and post-Marxists do, it's an oversimplification of the world. It's there's not just the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. There's not just three classes of natives, and even within a single person, there's not just for any corrupt politician, I'm sure you could also find aspects of their life where they're really good people, to their family or whatever. So it's just not that simple. I always find there's this massive oversimplification with these things. Maybe it's useful to a certain degree, but I've never found it useful.
I think with Fanon, I'll try to be Fanon bot.
Yeah, be Fanon bot.
Defend him. I think in terms of the colonizer good, colonized bad, or colonized good, colonizer bad thing, that's more he's describing the Manichean dynamics of, or the psychological dynamics under colonialism.
Yeah.
Because later on in the book, he talks about how there are, at least when it comes to the colonial cause, there were white people who were good or on his side, is how he would define good, and there were Algerians who were against him. So he acknowledges that there's a lot more subtlety and a lot more variation in the world. I think in this specific case, at least with the Manicheanism, that's more describing the psychology under colonialism.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And another point to just like be really aware of is like, because was this published in like 62 or 63, something like that?
I think it was 61. Let me have a
yes,
look.
something like that. So he's writing this like mid 20th century.
Yeah, 61.
And the situation in the Caribbean and Algiers, like maybe, obviously I don't know anything really about those situations, but like maybe this is actually even if it's low resolution, it might actually be somewhat accurate of what was going on in these places at that point in history. Whether or not it still could be characterized like that is in those places is a different question. I don't know. But maybe what he was saying about them at that point, especially what was interesting, at least to like find some parallels to Australia. And again, I'm going to try to like flip my perspective into like the point of view from white Australians over the course of history. There definitely seems as though there was, at least historically, there's like, okay, native workers, so like useful enough to get to do work. Although in Australia, it's not even necessarily the case, because actually like Aboriginal people, at least in New South Wales, were not even allowed to work. They call them Kanakas. I don't know if that's an offensive term. I hope it's not. But it's like South Sea Islanders and stuff. And also like Irish. The Irish are like under like bottom of the caste system. So like the Irish and South Sea Islanders and stuff were like brought to Australia, and oftentimes Aboriginal people weren't allowed to work. Yeah, at least in New South Wales. Even though they were importing like Chinese immigrants or wherever to do like labor and whatnot. But in places like Mauritius, that was definitely the case. So in Mauritius, and I assume like other like French colonies and stuff, they had an extremely tight caste system. It was like, you're African, you're working the fields. You're like Creole, you might get to do housework. So Creole being admixture of like European or Indian or Chinese or African, but you know, like generally like African European. If you're like Indian, you could be like a business owner, but you wouldn't really be allowed to like in the political part of like the social structure. And then it's like the whites in particular, like the Portuguese or, you know, a place like South Africa, it'd be like the Dutch or whatever, are like running the political institutions and maybe the larger businesses and corporations. And then over time, say for example in Mauritius, like a lot of the white people tended to like move out, but the police and the political structure is all run by like people of Indian heritage, not the Creoles or the African people. It's like often intensely like there's still that like momentum of the caste system, even if it's like not explicitly in the law anymore. And so there is that like labor aspect to it. Then there's an interesting thing with like the colonized intellectual, whereas like indigenous people in Australia are like not taken seriously unless they can speak English well, essentially, with very few exceptions. And I can literally only think of one exception of a notable Aboriginal person who could still speak English but had an extremely strong bias towards their language of origin, who's taken seriously, and that would be Dr. Unapingu, who like his artist name is Gurumul, and he was taken seriously because of his artistic talent, but
and also a lot of his songs weren't even in English.
Yeah.
That was...
But like, yeah, pick like the framework that has to be adopted is English, and that's a prerequisite for getting a seat at the table. Sorry. Yeah, and that's just, you know, that's the way it is. Fine. Like there's also a network effect of English, and there's like, you know, it's like the lingua franca now of the internet and all this sort of stuff, so that's fine. But you don't get a seat at the table as an Aboriginal person if you come in and your English skills are not strong enough.
Mm-hmm.
So somebody like Fanon can call it, the colonised intellectual. Sure, there might be some aspects of that are bad, but really, like, what choice do you have? If you're at this disadvantage, like the classic one would be like, I think it was Bennelong in Sydney. Bennelong, if I'm not messing up the history, I think it was Bennelong, or Pemaway, like one of those two people in Sydney had to do the job of learning English, translating, then like doing this interfacing between the colonisers in Sydney and like the Gadigal people there, right? Like that had to be done. Somebody has to like learn, like Eddie Mabo had to learn the Australian legal system to get what he had done. There's not really a choice. You have to adopt the framework because of the asymmetry of power, and the asymmetry of the cultural context you exist in. So like, I don't think it's like Fanon is necessarily like somebody might adopt the colonized intellectual, quote unquote, in Fanon's perspective, but that might also just be a purely practical thing. Like, what other choice does somebody living in Algiers have other than to adopt and to push back against French colonizers using what they know of French culture and French legal system and so forth? Do they really have a choice other than to just like take up arms? And then what was the third category? Oh yeah, the lumpen proletariat. To me, like whether you want to call it like the natives on the outskirts or whatever, at least in Australia, they're just like literally just on the outskirts, like literally just like put on the outside of town. So I don't know if the Algerian context is different, but like in Australia, those people maybe like got to like keep more of their language and stuff, but they're also until recently, and even maybe in some cases still like completely excluded from engaging with the rest of society. So I don't know how. I guess it's a useful framework to think through, but like, sorry, I'm getting so off track here.
No, that was, well, this is talking about Fanon's structure or proposed class/racial structure of colonized nations and comparing it to Australia. Because, like you were saying, there are some similarities, but also differences. In the case of the lumpen proletariat, it's interesting how he said, at least in the Algerian context, you had like the peasantry was still much more connected to native traditions.
Yeah.
Colonized intellectuals much more connected to colonized traditions, and the lumpen proletariat were just kind of in this no man's land where they didn't really feel a great connection to the native customs, but were also quite excluded.
Yeah, so that to me the parallel there life would be like with like missions in Australia, in New South Wales, because that's what I know. I can't necessarily speak for like other parts of the country, but like, yeah, that still persists. Like, there's still people who spend, and probably not as much as it used to be. Obviously, these days there's a lot more access to like, but like you go to a lot of towns in like Western New South Wales and stuff, and it's still extremely segregated. It's like the black part of town, and it's the white part of town. Like, fuck what, like, I don't get it very often because I hang out in metropolitan Australia, but every now and then it's a good reminder to just like go to a place like fucking Townsville or something, or like some town in like Western New South Wales, and just, oh yeah, that's right, I now remember what it's like to like get stared at with daggers when I walk into a pub. It's like, oh yeah, that's right. It still happens, and there's a reason why there's none of the Aboriginal community are like in this part of town, because they're not welcome. But the difference is, like, if you go to some parts of, like, for example, like Townsville and Magnetic Island, they would still like have a very strong sense of like potentially like connection to like pre-colonial culture and like the continuity of that. Whereas like in New South Wales, I find that like the history of missions and the kind of almost complete ablation or complete like deculturization and so forth is it's been such a long time. It's so complete that it's like you know it might fit under that characterization that Fanon has of like the middle ground, this like no man's land of culture.
Mm.
You know, like there's a different culture that has emerged in New South Wales of like Aboriginal people feeling like still have like continuity of culture. Maybe there's not as explicit as like language and stuff, but certain values or whatever around like, I don't know, like respect for elders and that sort of stuff. I don't know. Like, it still persists, but it's obviously gone through such a crucible over the last 200 years that, you know, it's very different to like other parts of the country. I don't know if I'd characterize it as a no man's land though. I'd just say it's like it's a culture that has had to change under like extreme circumstances.
I guess, yeah. It's Fanon situates it within this Manichean framework where there are two poles and you're defined purely along that one-dimensional axis. Whereas in reality, it's like there's not a no man's land, which is the dead center. There's like it's not culture neutral or culture negative. There's still culture. It's just not necessarily sitting in this Manichean framework.
Yeah, that's interesting. So that's quite a lot of colonialism. Should we get into how to overcome colonialism?
Yeah. So for Fanon, he said basically it's violence because colonialism is purely a violent act, and so the only way to counteract it is itself through violence. For him, I'm not sure whether he was saying this particularly within the context of Algeria and Africa more broadly, or he was talking about that. The question is how much he thinks it generalizes to all colonized people. That a consciousness of oneself, if you're a native, as something separate from the colonial system, only comes about through violence, and particularly through a revolutionary war. He was saying that class consciousness arises in that context basically by going out and shooting colonizers. And like we can talk about say how each of the different classes that Fanon laid out changes in response to a revolutionary war, but maybe being most conservative, at the very least in the African context, an independent consciousness only arises in war.
Yeah, that was one of the more interesting ideas. Oh, not more. Like, there's lots of interesting ideas, but this idea that like, so obviously, correct me if you think my interpretation is like off, but like, there's this aspect of like, okay, well, what binding idea can bring a people together to consider themselves a nation? And you know, like the history of France is a really good example of like they're like imposed a French national language on like the provinces and stuff. Like
post French Revolution.
Yeah. And so like in order to have this very strong French identity that we now have, like a few hundred years ago, I don't know if you could say that like people living in, I don't know, Burgundy or something would have had the same sense of like being French. They might have considered themselves like some more local culture or something like that. Whereas like the standardization and normalization of a single national culture after the French Revolution was done like quite intentionally. So there has to be some driving force behind this like homogenization and unification of identity. And the fact that he said like for a native people to like have that, it's going to be war essentially. Like it's like that idea from, maybe this is also Hegel's influence, but the need for total war, for nations to battle it out on the stage of history and to go to war and to like assert, to like actualize themselves. You need to do that through war. It seems as though that might actually also be like something coming in from Hegel. I think that was Hegel who said that sort of stuff. Correct me if I'm wrong again.
And it's not just Hegel. Like,
it's a bunch of people, yeah.
We've even on this podcast,
Yeah.
we've had so many people who've just said, like, yeah, you need war to.
Yeah, you need war to do it.
Like in Junger, like you spiritually transform under the stresses of mechanized warfare.
Yeah, so like
Evola, big fan of war.
Big fan of war.
Got a lot of war fans.
Yeah, and so in this case now it's like colonization. It's a very Eurocentric. Like, I wonder if Fanon even realized that. Like, actually, he's adopted this, like, the way that you form a nation is through this. Well, that's what the German and the French intellectuals were saying.
Or even the nation state is
the idea of a nation state,
particularly like a post 1789 European construct. It is funny. So you mentioning the colonized intellectual before, and throughout this book, Fanon does not like the colonized intellectuals. He just doesn't trust them.
Yeah.
When we talk about the pitfalls of revolution, he sees them as being the source of a lot of failed revolutions because they take power and effectively become the colonizers.
And I can see
themselves.
why he doesn't like them in the African context. All you have to do is like
he was
one of them.
He was one of them.
Yeah,
like
yeah.
he spoke French. He studied in France. He studied medicine and psychiatry in France.
Yeah, so the class,
like, it gives him insight into it, but he was, if not completely a member of the class, because he then fought against the French, he was born of that class, at least.
well, not just born of it, like he is, yeah, he continued it for.
But I mean, intellectually as well. When I say born of it, he was educated into that in France.
Yeah. So I guess taking a broader perspective on it, maybe he's trying to distinguish between, maybe by colonial, if we go back to his original use of the word, like being very much informed by violence, there might be an intellectual person from the natives who has learnt the colonizing culture in order to like operate, but they're not being colonial if they're not participating in these institutions of violence and exploitation. And he's referring to those Africans who not only learnt those like French cultural things and institutions, but then opportunistically leverage that to like just give themselves power or status, or like post like decolonization, like political status. And you just end up in the situation like you see it in so many parts of the world, like, oh, this like African politician is actually a billionaire. It's like, and like 10% of the country's kids work in like diamond mines or something. It's like, well, I wonder how that happened. You know, it doesn't seem like, it seems like you know, like you replaced one Balrog with another Balrog. You still just one had white skin and the other one's got black skin. I think that's the kind of people that he's referring to. These people who essentially just like are substituting one form of exploiter dominator with another.
Yeah, and being generous to Fanon, which I'm inclined to do because I take him seriously, I don't think he would consider taking some European ideas or ideas that originated in Europe, like Marxism, for example, and using them to examine the colonial context is necessarily an act of being colonized. I'm not sure he would have considered it in that way. I think his thinking was probably a lot more subtle.
I think so. Yeah. Yeah.
That's, I guess, how he would view violence and its use in developing a consciousness among the colonized. I guess it's a colonized equivalent of class consciousness.
Yeah.
It's interesting too.
Yeah.
He does trace out how this develops, at least in his idealized form, maybe, where he says native people have a muscular tension. He uses muscular tension a lot. This sense of tension of not being able to express themselves, of being colonized. And he says that at the most, this is a very, very early stage of the development of class consciousness. Again, sort of colonized class consciousness. I'll just use class consciousness because it very closely mirrors the Marxist idea of class consciousness when describing the proletariat, for example. So he says initially it's this muscular tension which eventually can give rise, which first gives rise to acting out against colonial law, like stealing stuff or maybe property damage. And eventually it builds up to physical violence against people. And he says initially this is physical violence between natives. So you'll have a lot of native on native crime as this embryonic class consciousness is gathering. And eventually it flips to violence being directed against the colonizers. And once this happens, I'm pretty sure, I'm not a Fanon scholar, the development of consciousness develops much more quickly because this is sort of galvanizing and collectivizing for natives. So they begin to organize their violence against the colonizers. And at this stage, Fanon says, great, people are developing anti-colonialist consciousness. But unless you have an organized party which can then politically educate people, this violence just kind of ends there. One, because the colonizers have much more organized violence and they can just crush it. And two, because it in itself can't fully develop consciousness. It can get you part of the way there, but you're going to need a vanguard. I wonder how much he was a Leninist as opposed to just a vanilla Marxist, because Lenin very much was also of the belief that you needed a vanguard party. But Fanon also seems to think that you need a vanguard party of people who are themselves educated in Marxism and in anti-colonial theory, who can educate these masses who've developed some form of consciousness through violent acts against colonizers, channel that through party structures into a more developed consciousness. But that's the general outline of the development of violence and the associated development of consciousness for Fanon.
Yeah. It's interesting, this idea of consciousness from the Marxist point of view. It's like very paternalistic, isn't it? It's like it's
paternalistic in that it's like you are conscious insofar as you agree with me, and you're unconscious insofar as you don't.
It's like it's actually now I say it out loud. It's actually extremely paternalistic. This is incredibly like the scholar sitting here in my nice where was Marx writing from? Austria or something? I don't know, Vienna.
I'm pretty sure it depends. When? Like he did a lot of his writing in London.
Okay, like somewhere, like London. I'm going to talk to you, other person, poor worker in the coal mine. You're not conscious of. I was like, I'm pretty sure the dude in the coal mine is pretty fucking aware that he's in a coal mine and that like
things are shit.
That the owner is like of the coal mine is like in some mansion in London. So like, I'm pretty sure that they're pretty aware of that. And they don't need some fucking douchebag from Germany like telling. I don't even know. Was he from Germany? Wasn't he? Or
yeah, he was German.
Yeah, like coming in here and telling me that I'm unconscious of my position in the class system. Like I dig it every day. So I think this applies here as well. I'm pretty sure in all these colonial contexts, the native people, individuals in their circumstances are pretty aware of what's happening.
Just looking around going, gee, isn't this strange? When they're unconscious.
And so maybe I'm not being charitable enough. Maybe to be more charitable, what the consciousness stuff is talking about is like, okay, consolidating that into like a sense of like solidarity, unification, sense of like collective unity under this single if you want to call it consciousness or like ideological unification, that also has like some cohesiveness to it, not just like a chaotic, you know, sense of unfairness and resentment and so forth, but actually parlaying that into like organized and coordinated social institutions or resistance or whatever. Maybe that would be a more charitable and not just like dismiss it as paternalistic.
Yeah, I guess for him, so in this book, he quite often talks about collectivism as good, individuality as bad, because he regards individuality as chaotic, as disorganized, as not providing any sort of organizational framework to resist colonialism. Conversely, collectivism is good because it allows for unity, it allows for directed purpose, etc., etc. So I guess for him, maybe the development of consciousness is movement from atomized individuals who can't organize to a unified, organized political party that can fight against colonialism. It might be that.
Yeah, and yeah, for sure.
Like that's me intentionally
yeah.
removing the Marxism from it.
Yeah.
Because also like, I don't really agree with this idea of unified consciousness. I don't think it's totally frivolous. Like I think people can become more aware of why Marxists think their situation is not as good as it could be. But I don't see it as totalizing as Marx did, for example.
Yeah.
But that was my sort of non-Marxist reading, or trying to remove more of the Marxism from it, which might have also just completely garbled the meaning of it.
One of the interesting things he said, it sort of ties back to the colonialism stuff before, but I think it comes up in this like overcoming colonialism, which is like a colonized native is going to be thinking something along the lines of like the West is the best, and obviously the colonizer thinks that as well. The Western colonizer thinks, yeah, West good, and then the colonized native is going to be like adopting, oh yeah, no, West is good. And part of like the decolonization process is fostering, cultivating, I don't know, like promoting an opposing narrative of like, no, West is not good. Like this oppositional, actually, does it even get to the point of saying like, I don't know if I'm misremembering, but like actually a hatred of the West. I don't know if he parlayed it into that stronger language, but like,
I don't think he talked about intentionally aiming to develop hatred.
No, but like that needs
in people, but
to like,
I think people certainly come to hate the colonizer, which he regarded as part of the development of consciousness.
Yeah.
I think for him, he talked about how at first the native envies the colonizer and wants to take their place.
Yeah.
Like basically just wants to transplant themselves into that ruling role and rule over everyone else.
Yeah.
And as consciousness develops, they come to want... He didn't explicitly say they want communism. There are some hints, but I might also have been overinterpreting that, knowing Fanon's intellectual background. But they'll develop in the direction of wanting to make a... not native anymore, because that they won't have that relationship to the colonial power, but an independent culture, a culture of that country that doesn't define itself with reference to the West.
Yeah.
So I think he would still consider like West bad, us good, as still having remnants of colonialism, because it's still a definition with respect to the former colonial power. He ultimately wanted a culture defined in and of itself, and one also that would be democratic in the sense of you would have the people, capital P people, and then you would have the party, and the party would be this organ that gathers the people's desires and then conveys those to the government, and the government enacts them. So I don't know if you'd like it's not a Westminster democracy. It's in some sense a representative democracy in that the party just represents the people's desire.
Yeah, well, but they're conscious of their class, or whatever now. So obviously,
and that's also
once you become conscious, you collectivize and unify with the values of the person writing about this consciousness awareness process. Naturally.
And it's like, as an aside, I guess this is less important in this episode, but again, when people talk about forming a single party that understands the will of the people and conveys that to government, I get very, very nervous.
Yeah, that was definitely one of the, if you read some of the criticisms of it, it's like, oh yeah, this definitely lends itself to authoritarianism, which is like a pretty consistent theme amongst Marxist and post-Marxist thinkers. It's like, I wonder why this keeps on happening. Maybe there's
they get out
reason.
of it by saying that once people have achieved sufficient consciousness, they happen to want the same things that the party will want. So in some sense, it's perfectly democratic.
It's the most perfect form of democracy.
Their wishes and those of the party are perfectly coincident.
Yeah, and any deviation from that is, I don't know, false consciousness, or colonial intellectualism, or like.
I guess in Fanon's case, he would just say, "Well, you've still got colonial thoughts in your head,
you're still
insofar as you disagree with
if
them."
If you're thinking for yourself and you're being an individual, you're still colonized. But if you're decolonized, then you're collectivist in the way that Fanon likes.
Yeah. Yeah, and he's very explicit in not liking individuality.
Yeah, so
in a political sense. Of course, I don't expect he was denying that people should have individual personalities, but at least in a political sense, they should very much be collectivist.
Yeah. Which just that's one of these issues with these sorts of writers, whether it's Marx or Fanon, is like, they've already presupposed that anybody who disagrees with them is coming from a particular framework or false consciousness or class interest. That automatically means like, well, the reason why you're disagreeing with me is because you're still brainwashed by that structure. And so you don't actually have to engage, like say like an African intellectual comes along and, doesn't like colonialism, but like completely disagrees with Fanon on like other aspects. Fanon could always just turn around and just say, you're still colonized. Yeah. It's like, okay.
And I expect that actually is what would happen.
Yeah. And it's like, okay, so you basically, we can't actually have a conversation then, like, because you're right. And any deviation from what you say is, you can just dismiss as whatever, colonization.
Yeah. Which also,
like, it's just not helpful. It's not a helpful way to conduct.
Fanon has done what I regard as a much more constructive thing. And he arrived at a place which, in many regards, I don't agree with, because I don't agree with large aspects of Marxism. But he took aspects of European culture and said, okay, well, I think these particular ideas, in this case Marxism, like have a large degree of correspondence to the truth, and so I'm going to use these to develop my own thoughts. That's what I regard as a very, very constructive thing to do. But having done that, he's kind of just pulled up the ladder and gone, oh no, but no one after me is allowed to do that.
Yeah.
Insofar as they diverge from my synthesis of European ideas, they're wrong.
It always
and
seems
they're
like
colonized.
the person who's synthesizing the thing has arrived at some manifest truth that is clearly self-evident once you see things there from their perspective.
Once you agree with them.
And that disagreement therefore must be because of like some impairment, intellectual, psychological, whatever, cultural impairment, where they can't see the manifest truth in front of them. Yeah, so when you get people talking like that, it's very dangerous. It actually means that like you can justify essential like violence, authoritarianism, because hey, you're right, you're true, like what your perspective is true, and so this other person is, in this case, like still colonized. So
yeah, it's so this like it's a reflex on my part, so I'm sure it's led me astray in many situations, but as soon as I hear people say that they are seeking to obey the people's will, I just recoil.
Yeah.
It just almost never ends well.
You're interpreting, quote unquote, the people's will. You get to interpret it. Your interpretation is correct. How do you know that your interpretation is correct? Like, hey, you're not allowed to ask those sorts of questions here.
Yeah.
My interpretation is correct because I've got the guns. That's why.
Yeah. I mean, oftentimes it does boil down to that.
Yeah, so should we move on to...
what do you reckon? Pitfalls?
Was there something to do? What did you want to talk about? Yeah, let's talk about pitfalls.
The places that the revolution often goes wrong. A lot of the time, he blames this on the colonized intellectuals. He really does not like these people. Maybe it's just because he spent a lot of time around them and just resented them. But he says oftentimes... So, okay, in terms of fail states, one fail state of a revolution is failing to set up a party which interprets the people's will and which politically educates the masses. So this is at the stage where the masses are getting violent. They're beginning to develop some sense of cohesion. But there's still a lot of false consciousness. And the party should come in and educate them. So a fail state is when this doesn't happen. So you just get increasing sporadic violence, and eventually the colonial power, because they are organized, comes in and violently suppresses it. And the revolution goes nowhere. It is not even really a revolution. It's just a peasant uprising. Another fail state is if the colonizers are kicked out. So you have a successful war. You've been able to organize to the point of having a cohesive fighting force. Kick out the colonizers, but most of the colonizing mindset is still present. And he calls it the development of a national middle class. So these native intellectuals who live in the cities, because you haven't decolonized the structure of society, they're the ones who best fit into the void left by removing the French, for example. So this is where he gets really Marxist. He says that the national middle class has never been able to develop as the bourgeoisie did in Europe. He says in Europe, the bourgeoisie, naturally, now that the stage of history has come that they are to be replaced by the proletariat, they're degenerate, they're dissolute. But when they were replacing feudalism, they demonstrated all sorts of positive qualities that allow them to become a powerful class. The discipline, the focus on money, industriousness, frugality. He says the national middle class in the colonized or former colonized country haven't developed these things. So when they get into power, all they've really understood is how to act as intermediaries between the colonial power and the rest of the country. They exist in this intermediate or intermediary economy. And he says they get into power and basically suck wealth out of the country by interacting with, foreign companies who want to extract resources from the country. They just sit in between foreigners who want to extract wealth and the rest of the country, or the country's wealth, get wealthy that way, ignore the people, ignore the people's will. He sees that as a major fail state. And, like, if assuming things for argument's sake proceed as mechanistically as he says they do, yeah, like, I would regard that as a fail state too. You've got a kleptocracy, which exists in many former colonial countries, say in Africa. You've just got a lot of kleptocratic regimes where you have a narrow band of a ruling class who basically just collect rent on foreign countries' mining, for example, like mining rare earth minerals or something like that. So whether those kleptocratic regimes arose in the way that Fanon describes, I'm not sure. Like, the way he sets it out seems plausible. I think, sure, maybe in some cases it's happened this way. I don't think, as we talked about earlier in the episode, it's always this mechanistic. But that's another fail state.
I suppose like
Those,
if you're thinking maybe we are actually being too, maybe it isn't as mechanistic because he's giving several different fail states. This is an example where he's like actually he's not being mechanistic. He's saying like these are things that could go wrong. But also like it's interesting. So he says like decolonization fundamentally is the substitution of quote unquote one species of man with another. In this case, it's take the European, and substitute it for in the case of Algeria, to be like a black African of Algerian descent, presumably. Not necessarily like from just any random part of Africa, like somebody from Algiers, or the region of Algiers. And it's noted that's not necessarily a good thing, because if the if the Europeans were kleptocratic and exploitative, and you just now you've just got a black kleptocrat. Right? Yeah. It doesn't really make the situation that much better, does it? Like, there's some pretty bad black kleptocrats and warlords and stuff, and maybe they're slightly better than but it seems pretty bad from the outside in. It seems pretty bad in some situations. I don't know if you can really call it an upgrade just because you've changed the color of the skin of the people doing the exploitation and the fleecing of an entire country of people. So I think that was really interesting that he called it a spade, I suppose, that hey, just getting rid of the Europeans isn't good enough if we're going to just have the same sort of power and exploitation. Counterpoint to Fanon, though, is it wasn't like Africa, was just a bunch of happy-go-lucky, people getting along before Europeans turned up. There's lots of slavery and stuff in Africa, and sure, the European colonizers did a bunch of bad stuff, but it's there's lots of bad stuff happening in Africa anyways, and Europeans left. Some parts of Africa have gone worse for having the Europeans leave, or kicking out the Indians or whatever. It's not just as straightforward as changing the skin color of the people or the racial background of the people in these positions of power in these institutions. And for what it's worth, if Fanon's trying to identify hey, we can't just substitute people, we also have to have them on board with not acting in the same exploitative ways. I think that's a good thing for him to call out. In fact, it'd probably be useful. That's why, again, to bring back to Bitcoin, listening to a lot of these African activists, and the reason why they're advocating for Bitcoin in certain parts of Africa is it's really interesting because they're talking out against the regimes of Africans in Africa, and these activists that maybe it's unsafe for them to go back home now because they're speaking out against these regimes. But these regimes are being run by black Africans, so it's just not that simple. And it's not just as simple as saying oh, well, the reason why they're exploiting other Africans is because they're adopting this colonial mindset. It's but if there was exploitation of people by political upper class before Europeans arrived, then you can't just say it's because of the colonization. Exploitation of populations has always happened. It's always been an issue. It's not just a colonial thing. And it happens here in Australia. There's I won't name names, but there's certain families and stuff in certain communities that have done exactly what you've just said. They're doing all the contracting with the mining companies, they're making all the money, and the rest of the community is still fucking poor as shit. and
Mm.
still good things to have like employment or whatever, but there's also there's a huge amount of imbalance there. And I don't think you can just like say, oh well, those people are just like, they're doing that because they've been colonized. Maybe they're doing it because they're people, and like people can be assholes.
More fundamental problem.
Regardless of like whether or not there's a colonial history. Actually, like the moral landscape can't just be reduced to a single point of like on the topology of this like extremely complex situation. People always have to grapple with these sorts of moral issues around governance and power and so forth.
Yeah, I think Fanon, it's some of the better parts of the book when he's talking about how things can go wrong. And yeah, like he says, in the colonial context, a lot of it is motivated by white against black racism. But then if you remove the colonizers, it's not as if Africa is racially homogenous. You just get a new brand of racism.
Yeah, well, there's plenty.
If it's going to be a racially based system, and he says the splintering of racial groups is another fail state because you fail to achieve unity within a country.
That was an interesting idea because he didn't make an interest. Oh, I don't know how much I'm overreading into this. It's like, yeah, Africa extremely ethnically diverse, like so many different ethnic groups, language groups, and just because they're all dark skin, you wouldn't necessarily consider them necessarily in the same race. Like to say Africans is probably too low a resolution a term. But then like within that, you might get a situation, like the worst example of it was like the Rwandan genocide, right? Where you have this like intense sectarianism or intense, I don't know would you call that like, I don't know where to draw the line between race and religion and culture. Sometimes it's hard, but like,
yeah, well, it's also not a clear definition. Yeah, exactly. Like they're all pretty
intermingled, right? But
somewhat arbitrary.
But this like reason for people to say like, we're people and you're not, and so we get to commit violence against you for whatever reason. Like he's trying to come up with a way that like to not have that happen. Because I'm sure as an African person he was very aware of all of these dynamics, and so it seems like a fail state. Like what happened in Rwanda is actually a fail state of like, hey, we should have had a national identity that like got rid of this division between us, but it didn't work.
And it's really interesting with that. He goes into why, or his problems with Pan-Africanism. So one of his mentors, I will have a really hard time pronouncing this person's name.
Yeah, while you're looking that up, Pan-Africanism is a really interesting idea. Again, like just for analogies, like to the degree that there is a parallel, like this idea of like an Aboriginal identity versus just like your traditional like group. Some people draw the division like by language, whatever. Like that Aboriginal, the idea of Aboriginality in Australia is in juxtaposition to the colonial context. Like I become Aboriginal because there is an Australia, but like my ancestors and like so even other parts of like Australia who still have like very like less colonial or like different colonial history, like being Aboriginal is kind of like a secondary thing to them. Like they really think of themselves as like Yolngu or Noongar or whatever, or like whatever, pick your place. Whereas like in New South Wales, there's definitely the sense of like, oh, I'm Aboriginal, and like you might not, like identify with so strongly like you're like especially if you're in Sydney, like there's people who like don't even know like what their ancestral, like they're Aboriginal, raised in, I don't know, like Blacktown or Redfern or whatever, and maybe they know like, oh, I'm Dungutty or something. And it's like, okay, but not necessarily have a real connection with that. Like the overriding identity is more of this like Aboriginal identity, which
Mm.
is like a response to being colonized. Whereas like in other parts of the country or in other parts of New South Wales, so like somebody like Dungutty is like up the coast from Sydney. Um, if you grew up on Dungutty country, it's like you might have a much stronger sense of being Dungutty than if you're raised in Sydney of Dungutty descent, but you've never actually really been there and you've only ever grown up in like in the context of like, okay, well, I'm Aboriginal. So it turns into this like an identity that is in response to a colonial context,
Mm.
but isn't. It's a new thing. It's not contiguous with like it's reactionary and it's not contiguous with like pre-colonial conceptions of like identity and so forth.
Yeah, you've basically just summed up a lot of Fanon's problems with Pan-Africanism in that, because he felt like it could be a useful stepping stone in developing consciousness, but ultimately it's still like you are defined as African or black in opposition to or as opposed to European and white. And he said, yeah, you can raise some consciousness that way, but ultimately you're going to need to form. He wanted a national identity.
Yeah.
So like a national identity that is a culture sort of in itself rather than a culture as defined by not being European.
Yeah, and for what it's worth, like in this context, like I would personally, in like the First Nations Australian context, like very strongly oppose that. Like I would not be on board with somebody trying to create like an Aboriginal state or something like that. And that's in part because like one of the issues that I think I've called it before on the show, like the monolith, like any particular group of people, non-monolith, but like in Australia, there's a very strong sense that like I am very aware that like I have very little to offer in way of like help or advice or whatever to a person from like, I don't know, the middle of the desert in Western Australia, me from Sydney. It's like actually this totalizing identity of like Aboriginality. Like sure there's some commonalities and stuff and there's a shared history of colonization stuff, but actually it stops very quickly when I actually have to acknowledge like extreme differences in historical language, culture, spirituality, modern like experiences of colonization, like contiguousness of language and cultural practices and stuff. There's a whole bunch of reasons why actually the unification under a single like nation state identity seems to me like just wouldn't even be appropriate. And I don't know if there are Aboriginal people in Australia who are advocating that sort of thing. But to me, it would seem like counterintuitive. Like, I don't know, some people want to, they call it nation building. Some people advocate it. I can understand where they're coming from. It just seems like, to me at least, it's like kind of counter to like, but maybe I'm being like, not being open-minded enough with it. I'm not sure.
It's hard because like the colonial history really, really changes things. I guess one way to see that the idea might be pretty counterproductive is to think about in Europe, for example, trying to make a European culture and impose it on people. Also would like, there's so much that is different and it would just, I just can't see how it would function in the same way an Aboriginal culture of the entirety of Australia, trying to come up with that and nation build on the basis of that seems like it erases so much difference.
Well, yeah, well, what did the French have to do, right? They literally had to like go in and force the standardization of the French language.
Yeah.
And to me, if any like group of Aboriginal people in Australia tried to do anything like that, that instantly just like it's so hypocritical. It's so inherently hypocritical. Actually, like the heterogeneity and the diversity of Indigenous Australians is one of the things that like most Aboriginal people would take a lot of like pride in. Like when I was raised, like my elders always said to me, like, Australia's always been a multicultural country. From the day Europeans set foot on this continent, there was all these languages, all these spiritual traditions. Like, it's always been multicultural, and it's a land full of boat people. Like, give me a break about like Syrians or whoever coming here on a boat. Like, Europeans came here on a boat under like distress of being in a penal colony, or because they're actually like trying to like find a better life. And that's how this country, like this the history, this 250-year history of this place is. Bunch of boat people came here to a place that was already multicultural, and anybody who would try to like homogenize like Aboriginal people would be like not taking that into account. Actually, like part of, I don't know if it's almost like a contradiction, but like part of the quote unquote pan-Aboriginal identity is an inherent diversity that like it should and can like maybe can, but like in my perspective, like shouldn't be homogenized in the way that like it seems to me having a nation state demands. But maybe I'm wrong, because Australia is a very diverse nation state. So fuck me, I don't know. that's my
Well, that's the thing.
that's my answer.
with forming a national identity, as Fanon wanted, like a national identity, as opposed to a Pan-African or Pan-Aboriginal identity. Like, a national identity still involves quite a high degree of homogenization. So, for example, in the legal codes governing a particular nation state, I guess you could have different ones. A nation state doesn't demand a single legal code, but even then, you're choosing some set of norms and social mores to impose. That's still a homogenization.
Or you get to these contradictions where you have really things that would seem to me grate a lot of modern Western people in a really bad way. You know, this idea like having dual legal systems. And like, for example, like in Arizona, that in the US, they've got they've got essentially a dual legal system, like where if you're on the reservation and you're native, you might come under like the jurisdiction of like the reservation laws. But if you're not native, you come under the state of Arizona's laws. Hey, this actually caused some really fucked up like issues in Arizona, where it's like, okay, there's like native women and girls being kidnapped, taken across the border to Mexico, right? But the state police aren't stepping in because it's a reservation and it's supposed to be like being dealt with by the feds, but the feds, like the federal police, but they're not dealing with it. So this is not an issue for non-native women in Arizona because they're falling under the jurisdiction of the Arizona like police system. So you've got this like weird gray area where actually like there's native women and girls in, or this is my information might be a bit out of date. This is like going a few years back that I'm talking, like maybe 5 or 6 years back. And so there's this huge issue when I was there in Arizona where they're like, there's these abductions going on and we're pretty sure it's human trafficking, but like nobody's stepping in because there's this like weird gray area of this like that has resulted because of this like dual legal system that they set up between the state, the feds, and the reservation. So it's not even like that simple to just say, oh well, like what's the answer to this? Having different rules for different people based on skin color in the same area, that sounds like a pretty fucking bad idea. It sounds like a really bad idea. Yeah, I don't really have anything much more constructive to say than that. It just seems like it's kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. Because then if like the state of Arizona did come in and say, no, we're getting rid of like the native court and stuff, and you're just all going to have to come under like Arizona law and stuff, then the like Navajo and stuff, they might start kicking up a fuss about like, well, now you're colonizing us. You know? Oh. Well, that's not good either.
Yeah. I feel like with maybe Fanon expanded on this in different writings, but at the very least, in The Wretched of the Earth, he seems to talk about developing a nation state and a national consciousness as this thing that fixes these sorts of difficult problems maybe different groups want different things. But he says, no, what happens, you set up a national culture, which is a culture in itself, not defined in opposition to Europeanness. Then you have a party that interprets the people's will and conveys it to the government, and the government enacts this will. It's what if the people's will is split? What if different groups of people want different things? This aspect felt quite underdeveloped to me.
It's very idealistic.
Maybe he's addressed it elsewhere.
It's very idealistic. There's this sense of like, I get it whenever I read these like Marxist-y type of thinkers. Is like there's a lot of idealism, and it's like, yeah, but the actual practicality of it is, you got 20 million people in Australia. There's no such thing as a single unified will. It's like, what was that guy's name that we read recently? The British dude, Fisher, Mark Fisher. It's like, yeah, just do what the general will of the people wants. It's like, mate, like how many tens of millions of people are in a place like England or the UK? It's like 80 million people or more, something like that. And from like every part of the fucking planet, like cultures and languages. In London alone, you can probably like walk around London and you'll come up against like 100 different cultures. And it's like, so you're going to extract one general will from that mixing pot. Give me a break. There's this like complete lack of, like, it's so detached. It's so out of touch. It's so abstract that it's like, I can't even take when people like Fisher or Fanon start talking in this way. It's like, actually, you just think that you're right and that people should just do what you think your political like prescription should be.
If people think really, really hard about what they want, then they'll arrive at what you want.
Exactly. And
if they haven't arrived there, they just need to think a bit harder.
Because of their class interests or because they're still colonized. It's like the people that disagree with me can't think for themselves. So anyways, any other interesting things? Did you want to talk more about the psychology stuff? How are we going for time as well? Because you've got to zip off pretty soon, don't you?
I'm all right.
So yeah, do you want to? Because you found that part really interesting, didn't you? The last essay?
I found this. This might have also just been because of medical training, and I find psychiatry interesting anyway. But near the end of the book, it's either the last section or the penultimate section, he gives a series of case histories for people that he treated in Algeria. Collection of people ranging from like a police officer who was torturing suspected FLN members and basically was saying, yeah, I'm having a really hard time. Can you help me torture these people without feeling bad? And Fanon at the end was like, yeah, I can't do that. I'm sorry. But I doubt he apologized. But it's just like, no, I can't help you torture people without feeling bad.
Yeah. In fact, that's actually a good response to have. Like, if you feel bad
this is a healthy response that's probably to torturing someone.
Your humanity telling you that you're doing the wrong thing.
In fact, I would go so far as to say it might be something you should listen to.
Yeah, not just suppress.
This might be a sign.
Don't get a clinical psychologist in or psychiatrist in to help you suppress those feelings of guilt for torturing other people. Why don't you just stop torturing them?
Can you help me become a much more dysfunctional person psychologically?
Can you help me be more evil, please?
Yeah, just suppress my consciousness. But so all the way from treating very, very active participants in the frankly violent part of colonial rule to people who were fighting for Algerian independence. And it's so some of it I find it interesting because he goes over it in a fairly psychoanalytic way.
Yeah.
Which in terms of the practice of psychiatry, I'm not really convinced of the utility of, but I find it interesting.
Well, it's a lot more this is 50 years more of like the development of psychiatry and psychology as fields and medical disciplines. So there's also that.
Yeah. No, but I just found him talking about really deeply analysing the psychological state of people in different positions within the colonial framework really interesting.
Yeah, there's two in particular that you've written down here. One that we can talk about is the criminality of North Africans, that part.
I was wanting to bring that up.
And the other one is the grenade situation. Do you want to talk about either of them first? They're both really interesting.
Yeah, we can talk about it in order. Like the North African criminality, I think he was citing, I forget the name of the person, but it was a professor at a medical school who'd published extensively on the physiological reasons why North Africans are inclined towards violence. And
there's sociological, anatomical, and so forth basis of why they're just inherently
violent. He's like talking about the shape of their brains, and it's like, this is why they're basically children who are just really, really violent. I found this part interesting mostly because at a higher level, oftentimes, like it really happens today, people say that something is scientific to say why it is, as a shorthand as to saying it is correct and you can't judge it. Like, you just have to accept this. It's not culturally predicated or anything like that. It is just correct if it's scientific. And I thought this is a really good illustration of the danger of a behavior that I see in many people whom I know, and you also see it in newspapers and things like that, of saying something which is deeply, deeply normative and very, very ethically loaded, but saying, no, it's scientific. And in saying so, implying that, this is actually value neutral. Like, this is
value neutral. This is just true.
Yeah, this is a transparent demonstration of reality.
They're trying to
without any of my preconceptions. And like if someone's still listening 2 hours 40 minutes in, just a really important point I want to make is that like science is a tool for developing models to approximate reality to hopefully a better and better extent. But you can still find a lot of culture in it. And you can still find, like, when you use the I guess, like, I wouldn't necessarily call the anatomical description of North African violence a fruit of scientific labor, but maybe in a better case, the fruits of scientific labor, you can use them to further specific cultural ends. Like, just because something is scientific doesn't mean that it's completely valueless. And this was a very, very good example of that.
Yeah, I would even go slightly further than that and say that, like, people who use the word science in that way just don't understand science. Like, science should immediately evoke skepticism and criticism. Like, it's the thing that you criticize. The reason it works is because of the criticism. Like, the reason why we have the advanced theories we have now is because the people who created the new advanced theories criticized previous theories. Like, it's inherently critical. And when people try to evoke it, like, it's the science. It's the science means shut the fuck up, I'm right. And actually, it's like, if it's the science, it's doctrine, because there is no the science. There's conjectures and there's refutations. And if you're going to say something is scientific, you're instantly inviting me to be absolutely critical of it. And the reason why it gets better over time is because our theories get hardened through the criticism. But even further than that, like, I would say that, like, when people are using the science or science in that way, like this guy here, often it's propagandistic. It's basically like, in this particular instance, it's like the guy's using pseudoscience, things like physiognomy and phrenology and that sort of crap, which these days is understood to be like complete pseudoscience. Maybe like during that time, it wasn't, people hadn't yet said, oh, actually, this is pseudoscientific. That's not.
What, you mean during the 40s?
Yeah.
People really liked phrenology back then.
Yeah, like, who would have thunk it that, like, maybe racialism as a pseudoscience hadn't clicked for them yet. Yeah, I wonder. Sorry, that was a bit of a brain fart from Levi.
It's like the most intense type of scientific racism.
Yeah, and this is where there's a danger with the power of science and the power that it gives us to control the natural world. When that and the prestige that comes along with being able to like make real scientific breakthroughs and so forth, when that institutional credibility gets hijacked for political ends, is so fucking dangerous.
Yeah.
It's incredibly dangerous. It's potentially, because science actually works, bitches, to quote Dawkins, because it actually does work. Like, if you want to, you can take the science of like evolution by natural selection, and you can apply that to create, like, to do eugenics on people. You can do that. It will work, and you can like breed people to be a particular way. Maybe not like intellectually, but at the very least, like physically. But by the same token, that means that like it comes with a huge amount of responsibility, and that you can't. It's incumbent upon us living in a more scientific and technological society to not just be like, okay, we're just going to let quote unquote the science be hijacked for political ends, because because of the power, the potential power behind it, it can actually lead to, in this particular case, it was more just propaganda, I think. But in other cases, it goes beyond propaganda. Actually, no, you can actually wield these tools to like do a great harm. What's really interesting though about this particular thing is like, the European anthropologists did it here in Australia as well. It's almost like they're looking under the African, or under the native, under the Aborigine. They're looking under us at, like, when I read these things, it's like being looked at underneath, not this particular text, but like if I read things by like, I don't know, like Redmond Barry or whoever, like, or like other Australian anthropologists, colonial anthropologists, it's like they're looking at us like it's a zoo or something. It's like we're specimens to be observed and analysed and pulled apart, and you can understand the internal logic of the native. And to me, it's like so dehumanizing when I read these accounts from these Europeans, because it's like we're being studied externally like ants, and not being considered, not being asked our perspective. Not, it's just like it's incredibly dehumanizing. Yeah, so fuck this guy. Not Fanon, the guy that's quoted.
Yeah.
That's why I also sometimes feel like I don't really like the violence, and I don't really like some of the more radical parts of things, but I understand like the emotion behind it. Because like when you read something like this, like, I'll quote the guy, says, "The North African is a criminal. His predatory instinct is well known. His intense aggressivity is visible to the naked eye. The North African likes extremes, so we can never entirely trust him. Today he is the best of friends, tomorrow the worst of enemies. He is insensible to shades of meaning, and Cartesianism is fundamentally foreign to him. The sense of balance, the weighing and pondering of an opinion or action clashes with his most innate, intimate nature." It's like when you read stuff like that, and if you were African and you read something like that, like say you're, I don't know, Frantz Fanon, and you've just gone to Europe from the other side of the planet to fight in this war for these people, and then you can't dance with white women, and then you read some shit like that, at some point I just think like, I kind of understand why he's so fucking angry, you know, like, and why you just be like, you know what, fuck these people, like, we need to get them out. Okay, I have to then draw, like, there's a point at which I have to draw a line in the sand and be like, okay, I feel very strong emotions right now about this. And I'm not going to let those emotions translate into necessarily my actual opinions.
Yeah. It's talking in that way about like the innate violence, like the anatomical reasons for the innate violence of natives, but also from the position of like a representative of a system that invaded a particular group of, like, a particular part of territory, and then enforces that rule violently. Yeah. It's like, you know, the violence might look different to like street violence. It's highly organized, but it is still, like, it's a very violent endeavor. This was also not very long after the Second World War, which was when Europe exploded in a paroxysm of violence.
Yeah. And also, who's the fucking criminal? Like, who came to whose land? Like, give me a fucking break. It's like there's no self-awareness. It's like I don't know, like I see it sometimes in like the Australian context in like some parts of the country where I just think like, how do I put this? Who, like, I guess I'll just say what I said before, like, who came to whose land and who's calling who a criminal? In this case, it's the European professor making this diagnosis on behalf of the colonial power that invaded Africa. Like, and we're going to call them criminals. And not for one second think, hey, maybe like all this like wealth and shit that we've got, to the degree that it's been like built by like stolen wealth and slave labor and that sort of, maybe that's the criminal part. Maybe that's pretty uncivilized. Like, to put chains around people's necks and make them work to build your fucking wealth and then sit there and like describe them as criminal, that seems like pretty fucking internally contradictory to me. But for some reason, it's like that never clicked. When I read these like anthropologists, like these like in New South Wales and stuff, read their work, it's like it never clicked for them that like actually maybe like coming from the other side of the planet and enslaving and killing people is the barbaric thing to do. Maybe you're the savage, not us. Like, I didn't come to your land and kill you. So I always found that like this lack of, it goes back to the same thing like I was saying before. Like, they use the word discover. You didn't discover shit. And then if we're sitting around here like we're naked running around a fire, well, not naked, but you know, like not wearing the same clothes as like Europeans,
not wearing a
three-piece suit or whatever, and we're like living our way, we're the savages, yet you're the one showing up with the guns and the cannons. But we're the savages. It's like, no, give me a fucking break. This entire framework said it like inherently puts in this case, the European colonizer as the moral arbiter of the situation. Yeah.
And I doubt it was accidentally too, like very, very intentionally.
Yeah.
The exemplar of European culture is the moral arbiter.
And in this case, like the priest,
because even in terms of like considering it, even in terms of considering it criminal or not criminal, it's like, so in the case of Australia with Terra Nullius, like the colonizers like only viewed their culture as the culture, and deviation from that corresponds to a degree of savagery. But they had their own legal reason as to why they didn't commit any crimes.
Yeah, so which was fraudulent.
I think it's very intentionally totalizing.
It's fraudulent. It's like they even had to like make up bullshit to get around their own laws. So like it was. Anyways, let's keep. Do you want to talk about the grenade story? I'll just keep on rambling otherwise, and just like
talk about the grenade.
The grenade story is really interesting. So it's like,
it's just about the person who blew up
a cafe. The African, this Algerian, was he Algerian? Wasn't it?
Algerian. I think he was Algerian.
Yeah. Blew up a cafe, and with a grenade, killed like 10 people. And the thinking was like, after he's come to Fanon, he's like getting essentially PTSD, and like this on the date that he, like the anniversary of the date that he killed these people. He gets like flashbacks or can't sleep and so forth. And one of the things that he sort of is battling with as the native who's overthrowing the colonizer is like, he then met some white people after these events, and they were very nice people. And he had the assumption that the people in the cafe that he blew up were all a bunch of racists and people who deserve and like oppressors and stuff. And now he's met these white people, and he's now thinking like, oh, maybe some of the people that I killed were not just like bastards, but actually maybe they were just like these white people that I like now. And maybe I killed people who were essentially innocent, good people. And so he's grappling with this like moral conflict. But then interestingly, Fanon says like, but there was no repudiation, there was no self-repudiation.
Yeah.
Because it was a necessary thing to do for the process of decolonization. I was like, that's so interesting. That's one of the most like...
Because wasn't it? Didn't this man also say something like, the revolution asks its price of everyone?
Yeah.
Like what it asked of him was, among other things, this sense of guilt.
Yeah. I don't know how much I have to say that. To me, it's just like this...
Really interesting.
It's just like... it's like this some things are so poignant, like how they capture the difficulties of being a person sometimes, this moral conflict.
Well, that's why I found this part the most interesting. I think in part maybe because the rest of the book, we talked about the mechanistic view of human affairs, how it felt a bit detached from people, but this bit really is looking very deeply at the complexities of individuals. Maybe it was the rest of the book is talking about humans in aggregate, where you do lose a lot of that subtlety. But this part is looking at individuals specifically, and Fanon is a very good observer of individual complexity, as he demonstrates in this part of the book.
I almost just want to read this last essay because I think it's the final essay in the book.
Yeah, I think it is.
Imagine just a whole book of like that, basically, of talking to people from different, Gazans and Israelis living in the kibbutzes next to Gaza, or like IDF soldier and Hamas soldier, or like a colonizer and a native, or whatever, and a look at the interiority of these people on these different sides of these conflicts. I think that last essay, to the degree that he's doing that in the context of Algiers, is super valuable. That's actually because it humanizes all the people, all the players in the story. And I think that humanizing, all the abstract stuff at the beginning, it's too detached, it's too political, it's too as you said, it's talking about people in the aggregate. And on that level, it's kind of in a weird way, dehumanizing in itself. But this exploration of actually what it's like to experience that, or to be the person who committed the killings or whatever, I found that stuff the most poignant, interesting.
Yeah, that was the best bit of the book by a long shot.
I don't even say, I'd go so far to say as if you had that sort of stuff, was it 12 Years a Slave? I think that book, you have these white people in North America, enslaving Africans, West Africans and stuff, and their descendants. And then they have this conception that somehow these Africans or these Negroes are less than them somehow. And then they read something like 12 Years a Slave, and they get exposure to the interiority of somebody who's gone through that experience. And all of a sudden it shatters their worldview about them being somehow alien to them. Actually, they have the same depth of love, suffering, the sophistication and intricacies of perspectives on the world and stuff. And it shatters this illusion of they're somehow lesser or whatever than the other. It forces, if a book like 12 Years a Slave forced slave owners or people in that part of society, white North American society, to, as I said before, take them seriously. And glimpses into the interiority of other people from radically different points of view, like this Algerian story of the grenade bomber, humanizes people and gets I think it forms, it's one of the few things that I think can form a bridge between people to actually take one another seriously.
This section of psychiatric case studies is both interesting and valuable.
Maybe we should try to find a book that's just like full of that. Maybe something by Jung again, if there's something else in there.
There probably is something more like that. I'm sure there are things like that.
So is there any other major concepts in the book that you wanted to touch on? Try and wrap up before 12. So I think you've got.
Yeah, I think those are the main things.
So what are our concluding questions?
Conclusion.
We've got some Oh, yeah. So would you recommend this book?
Yeah, I would. If someone can't be bothered reading the whole thing, particularly if they don't want to read sort of a Marxist-inspired analysis of colonial Algeria, then I would definitely recommend this last section of psychiatric case studies. If someone does want to read about that sort of aggregate analysis of social relations in the colonies, then read the whole book. It's not that long. It's well written.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you could actually read each of them standalone, do you think?
Yeah.
So if you just wanted to flick over like the stuff that you don't like, and then but it's overall I'd recommend it. It's really interesting.
Did he solve his problem situation?
Nope.
Yeah, I'm not sure that he did.
Historically, it's panned out really fucking bad. And
yeah,
sorry.
Yeah, no, I was just going to basically agree with you. He did warn against this, but it did happen. If you kick out one group of people in power without necessarily making a power structure that can withstand, say, kleptocrats or something like that, someone is going to fill the power vacuum, and it's almost always going to be the sort of person you don't want ruling a country. It's going to be a person who is most motivated by seeking power.
Yeah, and I would say the reason why he didn't solve this is because, as I said earlier, I don't know if I expressed it very well, but my argument was basically like that is not just a feature of colonialism. You can't just say, oh, the reason why there's African warlords now who are being exploitative or kleptocrats or whatever is because that stuff has always happened. Not just under colonialism or post-colonial like societies. That's actually something that your institutions have to deal with across time and space and culture. And when those regimes fall, that will still be an ever-present threat. And so like the decolonization part is important, but just decolonizing doesn't necessarily just automatically lead to good outcomes. It requires
a
lot more. There has to be some like philosophy of like there's this element of like these sorts of thinkers where they can tear things down very effectively. Fine, that's great. Criticize things, tear it down, but you can't just like tear it down and then leave a void. Like, you've got to be constructive.
And he did say that you would need a party to politically educate the masses and interpret their general will, but I feel like that's
can you be
so
constructive
vague
and then not be authoritarian
and so open to abuse that I don't really consider that a solution.
It's not really a solution. It's just like it's very hand wavy, isn't it? It's just like
which is weird because he's so concrete in the rest of the book. It's just when it gets to this bit, it's really hand wavy, which makes it much more. It just sticks out so much more.
Turns out, governance is actually a really hard problem,
and it's really messy.
It's really messy. It's really difficult to get millions of people to get along, trade, not kill each other. Especially if they come from different religious backgrounds and so forth. So pretty difficult problem, pretty gnarly problem. But maybe he solved some part of it.
I think he did solve parts.
He solved parts. What part do you think he did solve?
I think the idea of not trying to form so in his case, like a Pan-African movement, saying that's not going to work. You need something more high resolution than that. And a Pan-African movement is still going to be defined as black as opposed to white. It's still existing in relation to the colonizers or former colonizers is true. So I think that's a good way to point forward. A national solution like that still comes with a lot of homogenizing homogenizing factors that you still run into problems there.
I thought the problem that he solved, or like part of the problem situation that he made a decent contribution towards, and I agree with him here, is like, I don't know where he said this in the book, or if I'm reading between the lines or something. I'm pretty sure it's earlier in the book, but it's like, at the very least, part of decolonization as an Indigenous person of Australia, I realized at some point that, not with this podcast, for example, because this is just a general pod, for anybody, but there's also times where like I, or news outlets or whatever, can create communications or culture or institutions that are not in reference to the colonial thing, that are actually just internal for our community. A good example of that is like the Courier Mail in New South Wales. Like international listeners, Courier is like kind of like a very general term for like Aboriginal people in like New South Wales, and Victoria also use the word Courier, and like people in Queensland, they use this word Murray, at least in southern Queensland, and it's like low resolution, not quite as low resolution as Aboriginal, but not as high resolution as like he's saying I'm Ewan or whatever. So like, anyways, like the fact that the Courier Mail exists, and it exists to publish content that's relevant for the Courier community in New South Wales, and it doesn't need to be in reference this like thing that's in opposition to the colony or in opposition to Australian institutions. So it's just like it's internally generative. I think that's super important, and to the degree that like, and it doesn't have to be combative. To the degree that like Fanon is writing this for African people, or for members of, he's not writing it for the colonizer. I think even if I disagree with like the using violence and that sort of stuff, the fact that there's intellectuals, I can point at other people like Linda Tuiwai Smith is a Kiwi, or I should say like a Maori philosopher or educational philosopher, I think, or something like that. They're writing their intellectual contribution for an intended audience of the colonized people, but not as colonized people as at least somewhat psychologically and intellectually independent writing. I'm writing this thing, say in Fanon's case, I'm writing this thing as an African person who's been through this situation, and I'm writing it for other African people. I think that's good.
Yeah, it's not an oppositional culture, or almost a culture in the negative, as not something else. But it's a positive culture.
Yeah, it's not a culture that's in the gap of another, or like, and in particular, it's also not asking for permission. So there's two traps that you can fall into as an Indigenous person. Is that you either are always you define yourself in the way that you communicate in opposition to the colonial stuff, or you fall into this other trap, which is you ask for permission. You don't need permission. You don't need permission to have a perspective on any of this stuff. And to some degree, I understand why people take this approach. Like maybe I did it myself as well, like going through the Western education system. Some people go all the way to get PhDs, and it's because they know that if they've got the PhD or the master's degree in my case, it means that when I show up in like a Western context, I have this this intellectual validation. You wouldn't recognize, not you personally, Jack, but like, in many contexts, if I don't have a degree for something, this like Western validation, then my perspective is not like taken seriously. And because of that, you can fall into the trap of like somehow needing to have some sort of Western or Australian in my case, seal of approval of some sort. And to the degree that like Indigenous people in Australia or other parts of the world want to have like an independent intellectual tradition that is neither permission seeking of the colonial culture nor opposition to the colonial culture, but it's just like generative, internally focused or like community focused, I think that's really important. Even if you don't get to the point of like all these like idealistic things about like having your own nation or whatever, having a sense of like we're complete as a community in and of ourselves, that's super important.
Not sort of an incomplete, sort of a body in orbit.
Yeah, that's really important.
And it also seems like, I guess, it's hard to say with Fanon whether he would consider just violence necessary to building that, but something like the Curry Mail seems a lot more constructive than like going to war with Sydney or something like that. Like it just feels like that's
yeah.
Yeah, it's a better approach.
How could it be improved? I think we've said a lot about that already, haven't we?
Yeah, I think we've kind of gone over that.
Any episode-specific questions? I don't think so. We don't need to. I don't think we're good. All right, I guess that's the main body of like the stuff. Let's do some shout-outs. If you made it to the 3-hour mark, you're going to get a shout-out.
Shout out to Hyrotaf. Disappeared from the Discord. It's gone but not forgotten. Actually, shout out to Hamp AD for the artwork for the episodes. It's really, really good. Several people have said that it looks much better than the ones I used to do in like 15 minutes just before uploading. It's really nice.
We don't need to define you in reference to Hamp AD's artwork. We can just say
but
his stuff is
inevitable,
really good.
And one of us is clearly superior and should continue to make the artwork. Shout out to Patrick or Frat Earther. Left a very nice review of Tower on Goodreads.
That's very good. Oh, I should jump on Goodreads and leave a review. That's a good idea.
And just Discord people. Shout out to Your Old Memes. Slime Man, Hagersten, Pavlik, Jidev 1001, and Rowan. Shout out to Rowan to pictures of Otis, Rowan's dog. Shout out to Otis.
Yeah. Thanks for listening. I hope
thanks for listening.
I hope I wasn't too rambly on this one. We'll see.
No, not more than usual. It's just the baseline level.
Yeah. Well, yeah. As long as people enjoy it, we'll keep on doing it.
People are still listening.
Thanks for listening. Reminder, join the Patreon. If you want to get in contact with us, that's Levi at the Book Club from Hell or Jack at the Book Club from Hell, or go on Twitter, Book Club from Hell 666. I think it's still our handle. Or go to our Discord. I need to update the link on our website so that it's working. Your participation is appreciated, and if you like, let us know what you like or whatever. Like, we try to take those things into consideration when we're planning out the episodes and stuff.
Yeah, if we take a month off from uploads so that we can do Hegel, do a Hegel series.
Yeah. Cool.
Thanks for listening.